Welcome to a season where survival isn't a cozy fireside tale. It's a desperate gamble against hunger, cold, and plain bad luck. The hunger was a slow predator. It didn't leap on you in December. Instead, it crept into your bones by February, when the last of the preserved meat was gone, when the root vegetables started to rot, when every trip to the storehouse brought the quiet dread of counting what was left. You think about the way modern people complain when their fridge is half empty, but here, half empty is practically a reason to sing hymns of gratitude. There's a mainstream fact that medieval communities often marked the calendar with famine months, those late winter weeks when stored food was at its thinnest. Many deaths weren't from dramatic blizzards or sudden wolf attacks, but from slow malnutrition, the body quietly wasting away in the shadows of the hearth. At the same time, a quirky tidbit lurks in the margins. Some households apparently turn to brewing odd porridge-like mixes from ground-up tree bark. Yes, tree bark. You stir in some powdered birch and pretend it's soup. It's like the world's worst oatmeal, but it gave people just enough energy to stumble through another day. You drag your gaze across the landscape. The fields are still. No buzzing bees, no rustling crops, just silence. The kind that makes you think even the birds have given up. Farmers might let cattle nibble on whatever hay was stored, but there's not a green blade in sight. And here comes the sarcasm. Congratulations, you're now competing with your cow for dinner. Don't eat too slowly. But don't picture medieval peasants as endlessly grim. Survival was a grim necessity, yes, but people learned tricks. They gathered fallen branches and twigs before the snow covered them. They stacked dung and straw as insulation. They even learned to read subtle signs in the sky that might hint at when the thaw would come. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers had reliable weather lore or if much of it was superstition. Either way, when you're shivering through January, you cling to anything that feels like a promise. Now you stop for a moment, your boots crunching through ice. The road ahead is long, leading to villages where people huddle in their smoke-choked homes. The empty barns behind you whisper of lean months to come. It's the start of your winter journey, and already the landscape itself is testing you. You feel the cold creep beneath your clothes, the gnaw of hunger pressing against your ribs, and yet you keep walking. Because in the medieval world, that was all you could do. Keep walking, keep enduring, one frozen step at a time. You tug the hood of your rough-spun cloak tighter around your face, though the wool scratches at your neck like a swarm of invisible ants. Comfort isn't really an option. You're lucky to have something covering you at all. In winter, medieval peasants layered up with whatever they could find, and I mean whatever. Forget sleek parkas and fleece-lined boots. You're wrapping yourself in wool tunics, stitched together scraps of linen, and maybe the occasional animal skin. If the seams don't line up, too bad. You're going to smell like wet sheep, but at least you're alive. The average peasant tunic was made of coarse wool, heavy and unevenly woven. You throw one on, then another, then maybe a ragged cloak over the top, because layering was the only insulation technology available to you. No thermal underwear, no heat-trapping synthetic fibers. Just pile on enough itchy layers and hope your body heat doesn't leak out faster than it can generate. Historians note that wool, despite its itch, is actually pretty amazing for warmth, even when damp. But if you want quirky, sometimes peasants literally stuffed straw or moss into their clothing as makeshift insulation. Imagine shoving a fistful of hay down your shirt and pretending it's a North Face jacket. Cozy, in a barnyard kind of way. Boots? Well, let's not get too dreamy. Leather shoes existed, sure, but for many peasants they were a luxury. You're more likely stomping through frozen mud in wooden clogs or patched leather tied together with strips of cloth. The cold seeps up through the soles like an unwanted guest. Socks, as you know them, didn't exist. You've probably got strips of wool or linen wound around your feet which slide out of place every 10 steps. It's the medieval version of when your sock slips into your sneaker, except frostbite is on the line. You run your fingers over a patched sleeve, every piece of clothing. Here has been worn, repaired, handed down, and worn again. That cloak you're wearing, it might have been stitched together from your grandmother's cloak, your uncle's tunic, and the neighbour's old cape. Textile recycling before it was trendy, and when something finally fell apart beyond use, it wasn't tossed aside. Old cloth often became bandages, padding, or even candle wicks. Nothing went to waste because waste could mean death. Historians still argue whether peasants commonly wore fur in winter. The wealthier folk certainly did. Fox, rabbit, even ermine if you were noble. But for your class, maybe scraps of sheepskin, goat hide, or squirrel pelts if you were lucky, stitched together in lumpy fashion. You probably look less like a glamorous fur model and more like a patchwork scarecrow, but again, it's survival, not style. Though let's be fair, medieval Europe wasn't exactly full of fashion police. If someone mocked your moss-stuffed tunic, they were probably just jealous their moss ran out. You pull your cloak tighter and feel the weight of its damp fibres pressing on your shoulders. There's no such thing as waterproofing, not unless you rubbed your cloak in grease or wax, which some did. Imagine stepping outside in freezing rain, only to realise your entire outfit is now a 20-pound sponge. Congratulations, you're both cold and lifting weights at the same time. Medieval CrossFit, anyone? And here's a mainstream fact worth tucking away. Clothing marked class as much as warmth. Nobles could flaunt bright colours and finer weaves, while laws called sumptuary regulations sometimes literally forbade peasants from wearing certain fabrics. Not that you'd be tempted, you couldn't afford silk even if you sold the whole village, but it's a reminder that even the act of staying warm was tied to status. You're cold not just because the wind bites your skin, but because society decided your warmth was worth less than someone else's. Still, a quirky little practice creeps in. Some peasants lined their shoes with sheep's wool grease, also called lanolin. It worked like a natural waterproofing, though it left your feet smelling like you were storing a flock of sheep in your boots. Then again, if you haven't bathed since autumn, what's one more layer of sheep fragrance? Now picture this, you trudge through snow, wool scratching, moss rustling inside your tunic, and your feet wrapped like mummies in strips of cloth. The wind sneaks into every gap, your nose drips, freezes, drips again. Yet somehow you're grateful for every inch of fabric you can pile on. You glance toward your neighbour, who might be wearing fewer layers, and you can tell instantly some will make it through February and some won't. Historians still argue whether peasants suffered frostbite as commonly as we assume, or if their bodies adapted over time. Did constant exposure toughen them, or were why? Enters dotted with hidden tragedies, fingers lost, toes gone, scars beneath the wool. The records are thin, but the fear is real. Every gust of wind could mean another mark etched into your body by the season itself. And as you pull the hood low over your brow, snowflakes gathering like tiny daggers on the fabric, you realize this isn't fashion, it isn't comfort, it isn't even dignity. It's survival, itchy and awkward, held together by patches and prayers. Still you keep walking, shoulders hunched against the wind, grateful that for tonight at least you're not naked in the snow. You duck into a low, timber-framed cottage, your shoulders brushing against the doorway because medieval homes weren't built for height or grandeur. They were built for function, and even that function was questionable in winter. The first thing that hits you isn't warmth but smoke, thick, acrid, lung-coating smoke. Your eyes water instantly, your throat itches, and you cough before you even make it past the threshold. Welcome home. Most peasant houses in medieval Europe had one hearth, no chimney, no flue, just a fire pit in the middle of the packed earth floor. The smoke rose upward, hesitated at the thatched roof, and then decided to hang around like an uninvited guest. The result? Your cottage smelled like a mix of burning oak, damp wool, and eye-watering smoke that curled through your nostrils every single day. Forget scented candles, forget ventilation fans. You lived in a fog machine 24/7. Now, here's your mainstream fact. Smoke-choked interiors were so common that many peasants developed a kind of constant cough, and respiratory issues were basically built into peasant life. Archaeologists studying skeletons often find signs of lung damage consistent with years of smoky exposure. Imagine being born into a home that made you wheeze before you could even walk. Congratulations, your house is trying to kill you. But there's a quirky flip side to this misery. All that smoke actually helped preserve the thatched roof. The constant fumes deterred insects, slowed rot, and acted like a crude pesticide. So yes, you're hacking up phlegm daily, but hey, at least the beetles aren't eating your roof beams. Silver linings, right? You push further into the dim cottage. The fire burns low, more embers than flame, because wood is precious and running out is easy. The warmth doesn't spread far. If you sit close, your face might be warm, but your back still eases. If you sit far away, both sides freeze equally. There's no perfect seating chart, only compromises. You shift on the bench, trying to angle yourself just right. Your eyes adjust to the dim glow. Furniture is scarce. A couple of rough stools, maybe a chest doubling as a table, straw scattered across the floor. The walls are wattle and daub, sticks woven together and plastered with mud and dung. You touch it, and it crumbles a little under your fingers. Insulation? Barely. Wind sneaks in through every crack, whistling around your ears like a ghost with bad timing. Historians still argue whether peasants truly spent their entire winters cramped indoors, or if many worked outside more than we assume. Did people hibernate in their smoky huts, or did necessity drag them into the fields no matter the frost? What's certain is that, when you were indoors, you weren't basking in cozy warmth. You were simply choosing the lesser evil, smoke or frostbite. You glance toward the ceiling, the rafters double as storage, onions braided together, strips of salted pork if you're lucky, herbs drying in bundles. Sometimes meat was hung above the fire so smoke cured it slowly, adding both flavor and a protective coat of soot. Bon appetit, you're eating pork a la chimney. And yet people craved that smoky tang. It was a marker of preservation in an age where fresh meat in February was rarer than Wi-Fi in the woods. You shuffle closer to the hearth, feeling the straw crunch under your boots. A dog lies nearby, curled tight, sharing body heat with anyone who doesn't mind the fleas. And you, whether you like it or not, have probably made peace with fleas. They're as much a part of your household as the fire itself. A quirky little detail surfaces in your mind. Some homes had a literal smoke hole in the roof to let air out, but in heavy snow, those holes got blocked, which meant if a storm piled onto your roof, you were suddenly hotboxing your own home in medieval smoke. Not exactly the relaxation experience anyone would ask for. You watch the family gather, shoulders huddled together, eyes rimmed red. The children rub their hands over the embers, not really getting warm, just less cold. The mother ladles out thin broth from a blackened pot. You sip and taste mostly boiled water, a hint of onion, maybe a fleck of barley. But in this smoky cocoon, even that watery spoonful feels like a gift. And as you sit, blinking through the haze, you realize this. The medieval home wasn't a place of respite. It was a balancing act between suffocation and freezing, a shelter that barely sheltered, a space that demanded endurance instead of comfort. And yet, somehow, you find yourself grateful, because outside the wind howls like a starving wolf, and in here, at least, you can still draw breath, smoky though it may be. Night presses down like an extra wool blanket, heavy, scratchy, and only barely helpful. You shuffle toward the sleeping corner, cheeks tingling from the smoke and the cold you dragged in on your cloak. There's no polite talk about personal space. There's only space and whether your body can occupy enough of it to stay warm. Beds in this world are a negotiation. You, your family, perhaps a widowed neighbour, 2 children who refuse to stop whispering, and, oh yes, the small cow tethered by the door who radiates a calm, hay-scented heat. Congratulations, you've been upgraded to the medieval warmth economy, where every heart is a furnace and every shiver is a tax. You crouch to the mattress, if mattress is the right word. It's a paillasse, a sack stuffed with straw and reeds, the kind that crinkles when you roll over and stabs you with mystery splinters at the worst possible moments. The straw must be changed now and then, or it turns into a micro-kingdom of mites. For tonight you pat it flat, as if that will convince it to be soft. Your blanket is woven wool, heavy as a confession, and underneath, a thin linen sheet does its best impression of fresh, which in winter means not damp. You lay down, and the bed exhales dust like an old dog. Charming. Everyone sidles in. You learn to sleep shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, a human braid arranged by seniority and body heat. The baby goes in the warmest spot, against the mother's belly. Grandfather takes the edge so he can cough in peace. You wedge yourself between 2 cousins and make a silent pact not to breathe directly into each other's faces. Someone mutters a short prayer. The dog hops in and plants itself across 3 sets of feet, like a shaggy hot water bottle with opinions, and in the doorway the cow snorts a serene, lowing radiator. Sure, it's not exactly the luxury spa experience, but on the bright side the heating never goes out. It just occasionally wanders over to chew cud. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many rural households, animals were kept in the same building as people, sometimes in a partitioned end of the longhouse or under the same roof. The animal's body heat mattered. They were living thermal mass, and a cow could raise indoor temperatures a few precious degrees. It's not glamorous, but neither is frostbite. The cost is smell, a bouquet of hay, dung, and damp wool that no medieval candle can conquer. Think of it as rustic aromatherapy, storage-scented edition. No refunds. Before sleeping, someone checks the hearth. The coals are banked under ash to smoulder through the night. You remember yesterday's bell from the church tower, the curfew from the old French couvre-feu, cover the fire, a winter habit baked into law and safety. Covering the embers helps prevent sparks from leaping onto thatch. You don't want your roof going whoosh while everyone's bundled like sardines. You'd be a very crispy tin. A hand passes you a wrapped stone, warmed by the hearth and swaddled in spare cloth. It's a humble bed warmer, and it lives at your feet beneath the covers. Quirky tidbit. Some families warmed small stones or bricks at the fire and slipped them into the bedding, a poor person's radiant heater that made toes feel like they'd just visited a tiny volcanic spa. You place it near your ankles, hiss at the heat, and then bliss. The stone slowly cools as you drift. Across the straw, a symphony begins, wheezes, snores, the occasional calf sigh, and the soft skitter of a mouse with audacity. Privacy is a rumour you once heard from a traveller. You learn to ignore the soundtrack, or you lean into it. After all, white noise machines haven't been invented. And this is the next best thing. Joke 1. You consider starting a medieval ASMR channel. Live cow hum. Plus hearth crackle for 12 hours, but your audience would just be the cat who already subscribes. You shift, careful not to elbow your cousin. Beneath you, the straw pokes like an inquisitive hedgehog. You scratch your scalp and wince, half expecting to meet a louse patrol. Cleanliness standards are a little different when water is partly frozen and the wind knives through door gaps. You tug the nightcap lower over your ears. Yes, a nightcap, not just for cartoon characters. It keeps heat from fleeing out the scalp, which is basically a traitor to every winter bed. If you're feeling fancy, you pull your cloak over the blankets for extra weight, a medieval weighted blanket that doubles as your daywear and your emotional support textile. First sleep sidles up next to you, and your mind slides into that drowsy river where thoughts loosen, then tangle. Historians still argue whether segmented sleep, first sleep and second sleep separated by a quiet, wakeful interval, was a universal pattern or a patchwork, shifting with latitude, season, and class. Tonight, it makes sense that you might wake around midnight. The coals need a nudge, the cow needs a murmur, and someone needs to whisper a prayer for the sick neighbor. Maybe you step to the door, press your palm against the wood, and listen to the snow's hush. The pause feels normal, not insomnia, but a sanctioned island of wakefulness where chores, dreams, and small talks like this one curl together. You slide back beneath the covers and feel the human heat you helped create. It's not romance, it's thermodynamics. Proximity is policy. Babies survive because bodies bracket them. Elders last the winter because the younger keep watch. In deep frost, even neighbors might share a space for a week if illness or a broken roof forces it. Not because anyone's excited to add a snorer, but because dividing warmth is better than dividing grief. Joke 2, you draft a bed-sharing charter, Articles of Confederation of this mattress, with clauses about elbow quotas and mandatory pre-sleep foot-warming fees payable in jokes. Your breath plumes in the air until the pile of blankets traps it. The room's geometry bends toward the hearth. Sleeping furthest from the fire is a rotation, a little fairness ritual so nobody stays in the cold corner forever. The kid who misbehaved gets the drafty spot tonight, a justice system both swift and meteorological. You lie still as a pop echoes from the rafters, frost arguing with wood. Somewhere in the roof thatch, a sparrow rustles, finding its own version of indoors. Everyone, it seems, is negotiating with January. You think of the church's stone floor earlier, how cold it was under your knees. Even there, God's house, the cold travels like a pilgrim, and the faithful huddle closer during vigils. In your cottage, faith is practical. You cross yourself, murmur gratitude for the cow, and promise to patch that window gap tomorrow. Your hand finds the warmed stone again. It's only pleasant now, a tepid moon in a private sky. The humour idles low for sleep. Joke 3, you vow to invent a revolutionary product called sock, a foot burrito that never slips. Too bad you're 8 centuries early and no one has venture capital except the Lord, who prefers investing in walls. Outside, the village dozes under snowcaps. Inside, you've built a small climate from breath and patience. This is not loneliness, it's a crowded tenderness that pretends to be inconvenience. You memorize the steady rise and fall of the bodies around you. Tomorrow the fields will still be frozen, the smoke will still sting, and the straw will still argue with your skin. But for now, the arithmetic of survival has balanced. You brought your heat, they brought theirs, and together you made a night that doesn't bite. Somewhere between first and second sleep, you dream of a real mattress, the kind that doesn't crinkle or host a flea parliament. Then you wake enough to adjust the paillasse, punch down the straw like dough, and decide the dream can wait until April. Winter doesn't ask for luxury, it asks for company, and you have it. Snoring, mooing, sighing, snuffling company, woven into a blanket of sound that somehow keeps you warm. Morning comes as a grey smear at the cottage door, and you sit up from the straw thinking of only one thing, something warm to quiet the hollow thump in your stomach. The hearth clicks, a ladle scrapes, and there it is, the daily winter drumbeat, thin porridge, thick bread. You don't debate menus, you negotiate survival. You slide to the fire, palms presented like offerings, and watch as the pot releases a soft, hopeful steam that promises more comfort than calories. Porridge is the season's metronome. You stir oats, barley, or whichever grain your harvest left behind, the spoon tracing slow circles as if you could hypnotize hunger. This isn't the kind of porridge that sits on cafe chalkboards with toppings and punny names. It's a pale, honest slurry. Still, it's warm, and warmth is worth more than flavour in January. A pinch of salt if you have it, a dash of onion if a braid still hangs from the rafters, a lonely kale leaf sliced thin for colour, the medieval equivalent of garnishing with hope. If someone traded for a spice once upon a Michaelmas, a miracle fleck of pepper turns up like a rumour and vanishes just as quickly. You take a sip and your stomach says, "Thank you, I'll file that under symbolic." Bread anchors the bowl, a chunk of rye or maslin, that thrifty mix of wheat and rye, so dense it could draft for the village wrestling team. You cut it with the sort of reverence reserved for relics, because this loaf has to last. The crust is dark, Saint Erdy, a fortress wall around the crumb that's tight and slightly sour. Yesterday's heel becomes today's trencher, a plate made of bread, soaking up the porridge until it's soft enough to chew with winter-tired teeth. Joke 1. You consider writing a cookbook called 50 Shades of Beige, but the editor rejects it for being too colourful. You chew and picture the road your bread has travelled. Autumn's grain threshed with flails, winnowed against a skittish wind, ground at the Lord's mill for a fee that shaved your flour and your patience. If the village has a bake oven, families crowd their loaves in by turns, each marked with a symbol scratched into dough. Crosses, chevrons, a little star that's really your cousin's attempt at a chicken. On weeks when fuel runs low, you bake less and rely on hard rusks that wait like quiet soldiers in a chest, ready to be revived by broth. Warm the rusk in porridge and suddenly you have something that fights back against the cold from the inside. Mainstream fact time. For many peasants, rye and barley were the winter backbone, with wheat as the fancy guest who rarely visited. Bread could be so central that wages and rents were calculated with grain in mind. When the harvest failed, prices spiked and bellies suffered the translation. You swallow and the thought lands heavy. Bread is a calendar, a ledger, a weather report, and a prayer all at once. You break your piece in half to share with a child who stares at the pot the way you stare at a sunrise in spring. The porridge receives a final swirl, and you remember our earlier flirtation with desperation. Bark in the bowl. You haven't forgotten the rumour of birch or pine flour folded into dough during the meanest seasons. Bark bread, famine bread, whatever folks called it while trying not to cry. Consider this a weary callback. The forest pantry is not fashionable, but it exists, alas. Tea-ditch binder of starch and willpower. Joke 2. You dub it forest to table, but even your sense of humour refuses a second bite. A few days each week, taste of fish. Salted herring, so assertive it announces itself from the doorway, or dried stockfish that needs a long bath and longer persuasion to become chewable. You flake tiny pieces into the porridge so the pot smells like the distant sea. If you happen upon a sliver of pork fat from autumn's pig killing, it renders in the spoon like bottled sunlight, turning the colour a shade braver and lifting spirits at least 2 inches. Cabbage and leeks, chopped thin, attempt a little drama in the beige bowl. They're winter's local celebrities, the dependable greens that survive with stubborn peasant energy. And when the church calendar calls for fasting days, more frequent than your modern stomach would negotiate, you obey, turning to fish, legumes, and the virtue of pretending you're full. Historians still argue whether the average peasant's winter diet was monotonous by choice or simply by necessity, and whether pottage plus bread masked regional ingenuity more than we admit. Did every village taste like every other, oats here, barley there, or did microclimates and tiny trade routes sprinkle more variety than the textbooks imply? Whatever the case, your bowl tonight is familiar, and familiarity is its own spice. You lift it, blow, sip, and let the heat unfurl down your throat like a ribbon. You think of hazards hiding in the loaf. ergot haunts Rye in wet years, a dark fungal curse that can twist limbs, spark visions, and turn a village's winter into a bad dream. You can't see it easily. Sometimes the bread just tastes odd, or your fingers tingle at the edges of day. When the season runs lean, you eat what you have and pray the fungus chose another field. Meanwhile, the miller gets side-eyed. Was his measure honest? Did his stones grind a touch too much away? Grain is trust, and trust is always on the table. On better mornings, a splash of buttermilk, or a lump of hard cheese fortifies the porridge. Dairy doing the work of sunshine you don't have. When a cow calves, the rich days start again. But winter is stingy with that good news. Honey appears only as a holiday rumour, a spoon kiss at feast days if the hives were blessed and the beekeeper lucky. Most days are simply this: a bowl, a crust, and a quiet agreement not to complain out loud. Joke 3. You float exactly 2 peas in the porridge and declare it luxury stew, which convinces nobody but does amuse the cat. You mop the last streaks with your heel of bread and run a thumb over the coarse crumb as if to memorize it for later. Food has to stretch not just across plates but across time. Today's pot water becomes tomorrow's base. Today's stale bread becomes thickener. Today's bones, if they exist, become broth that tastes like memory. You too learn to stretch. Patience, appetite, and the line between hungry and fine. And when you glance at the store pit, counting the turnips with the solemnity of a banker, you realize your arithmetic of survival includes every crumb on this table. A quirky tidbit to savor with your last bite. Some families saved the darkest end crusts, the ones most smoked by the hearth, to use as makeshift coffee filter precursors centuries before coffee shows up in their lives, straining broth through bread to catch grit. The bread swells, the broth clears, and the crust ends its career as a sort of edible sieve. You smile at the ingenuity, and at the fact that ingenuity still leaves you hungry. Outside, the day climbs no higher than a pewter light. Inside, your breath fogs again as the fire dips. You tuck the remaining loaf into a cloth, stash it away, and remind yourself not to slice too thick tonight. Thin porridge, thick bread, that's the chant, the discipline, the winter catechism. You'll hum it under your breath while you mend a handles. While you check on the cow, while you calculate whether the onions will make it to Lent. The belly remains unconvinced, but the body, stubborn, practical, accepts the terms. You rinse the bowl with hot water, give the dog an optimistic sniff of the spoon, and set the pot back on its hook. Tomorrow's breakfast is already thinking of you and you of it, a quiet pact forged in steam and patience. You press your palm to your stomach and feel not fullness but fuel, enough to carry you to the next task, enough to meet the cold at the door and shake its hand without flinching. The meal was small, the ritual big, and somehow in that arithmetic you win the day by a mouthful. You lean back from the smoky hearth, lips still tasting of yesterday's rye crust, and raise the wooden cup that waits on the bench. It isn't water inside. In winter, water is suspect, icy, stagnant, sometimes full of things you'd rather not list while trying to relax. Instead, you sip ale, the quiet partner of every medieval table. It isn't the golden, frothy pint your mind might imagine. It's a thin, murky, slightly sour brew. More food than drink, more habit than luxury. You swallow, and your stomach answers with a nod that says, yes, this will keep us alive another day. Here's the mainstream fact. Small ale, as it was called, was brewed at such low strength that it rarely got anyone drunk. Its purpose wasn't to throw parties, but to purify. Boiling in the brewing process killed off microbes, making it safer than the raw water from the well or stream. Children drank it, old men drank it, and you drink it now, not for fun, but for survival. Each cup is a medieval vaccine against dysentery, and yet, while it might keep you safe from the waterborne nasties, it also leaves you belching softly like a lazy donkey. a quirky tidbit floats in with the steam. Some villages flavoured their ale with whatever herbs they had on hand, from yarrow to bog myrtle, long before hops became common across Europe. Imagine sipping a pint that tastes suspiciously like a swamp bouquet and then telling yourself, "Ah yes, the terroir this year is particularly marshy." You grin despite yourself. Joke 1. If this were a modern craft brewery, they'd call it limited edition hedge ale and sell it for $15 a glass. You glance at the brewing corner of the cottage. Every household brewed its own ale, often weekly, because freshness mattered. With no refrigeration, small ale soured fast, so the cycle became as natural as kneading dough. Brew, drink, brew again. Grain from the store pit doubled as food and as liquid rations, a delicate balancing act. Too much ale, not enough bread. Too much bread, not enough ale. The housewife managed it with grim efficiency, measuring barley by handfuls while praying the miller hadn't shorted her last week. Historians still argue whether peasants were constantly tipsy or whether the weak strength of small ale left them as sober as tea drinkers. Contemporary records sometimes complain about drunkenness, but it's hard to separate fact from stereotype. What's certain is that ale wasn't optional. It was daily hydration, liquid bread, and community fuel, all poured into cups that rarely went dry. You sip again, feeling the warmth spread down your chest. It isn't intoxicating, but it is comforting, like liquid straw for the soul. Sometimes on feast days, stronger ale appears, a heavier brew reserved for celebration. You remember the last Yuletide, when a neighbour tapped a cask thick enough to wobble your steps and loosen your tongue. You'd laughed harder that night than all season, stories spilling like froth. Now, in the plain grey of January, your cup is thinner, but the memory clings. You run a finger over the rim and think of the economy behind it. Ale wasn't just homemade, it was also a trade. Some women, known as alewives, brewed enough to sell jugs in the village, their profits paying rents or buying a rare bit of cheese. Picture a crooked sign swinging in the cold wind, painted with a bundle of hops or a foaming tankard, signalling to the weary that drink awaited. You stop by, exchange a coin or two, and leave with a jug that sloshes like liquid hope. Joke 2. You picture the medieval Yelp review. Cozy smokehouse vibe, hints of bog myrtle, 3-5 stars, would drink again if desperate. Your mind wanders to the church calendar again. Fasting rules forbid meat on certain days, but ale was liquid, and liquid was fair game. Monks leaned into this loophole with gusto, brewing beers so rich they could practically be chewed. You're not so lucky, your ale is watery, but you can still raise a cup and mutter a toast, convinced that God probably approves as long as you don't fall into the snow face first afterward. The children slurp it too, their small hands gripping cups with familiarity. You wince, half modern, half medieval, and remind yourself that their ale is weaker than weak, more barley tea than brew. Their laughter sounds bright in the gloom, bubbles of sound against the dull crackle of the fire. You take another gulp, wipe your mouth with the back of your sleeve, and let the tang settle on your tongue. Your body thanks you for the calories, for the safety, for the ritual. And as the jug passes hand to hand, you realize that ale isn't just drink, it's glue. It binds families, fuels work, and oils the dull gears of winter life. In the background, the cow exhales like a low drumbeat. The dog snores under the bench, and the ale completes the scene. Smoky cottage, scratchy wool, and a shared cup raised against the cold. Historians still argue whether ale alone carried peasants through the winter or whether we overplay its role, ignoring ciders, watered wine, and broths that filled the same niche. But in this moment, ale is enough. You raise your cup one last time, take in the scratch of wool on your neck, the sting of smoke in your eyes, and swallow the day down in a gulp that's part habit, part comfort, part defiance of the frost outside. Joke 3 muttered into your cup. To surviving another day in January, may the ale outlast the fleas. No one laughs, but you smile anyway because you know the ale heard you. You step carefully across the packed earth floor and lift the trapdoor at the far corner of the cottage. A damp, earthy breath rises up, cool and heavy, smelling of clay, onion skins, and salt. This is the root cellar, your winter lifeline, the quiet vault where survival is counted not in coins but in turnips. You descend the wooden rungs, torch in hand, and your eyes adjust to the dim shelves carved from stone and earth. Here, in this little underworld, food waits, not plentiful, not luxurious, but enough to make the difference between tomorrow and oblivion. The shelves are stacked with onions twisted together in long braids, their papery skins flaking like moth wings. Next to them lie cabbages, some still crisp, others sulking into mush, smelling faintly like regret. Potatoes haven't yet conquered Europe, so your starches are turnips, parsnips, carrots, roots that know how to hibernate. Each one looks like a stubby candle of calories. You run a finger across a row of wrinkled apples stored in straw. Their skins are withered, but they still release a faint sweetness when bitten. The cellar is no cornucopia, it's a math problem, and each bite subtracted means one less day of certainty. Here's your mainstream fact. Medieval storage pits and root cellars were essential, dug below frost lines to keep vegetables cool and edible for months. Without them, harvest abundance in autumn would rot away by midwinter. Archaeologists sometimes find these pits, their outlines revealing how entire families banked their hope in the ground. A quirky tidbit joins in. In some places, salted fish was literally stored by being packed into barrels, layered with salt until it looked more like gravel than dinner. You imagine prying one of those slabs out on a February evening, the fish so stiff you could use it as a weapon before soaking it back into something chewable. Joke 1. Dinner or bear? Ludgeon? Why not both? You turn toward the barrels. Salted pork glistens faintly under its crystalline blanket. A cut of bacon is worth its weight in gold this time of year, and you guard it with a dragon's jealousy. Salt is precious, an imported luxury in some regions, a monopolized resource in others, and preserving meat with it was as much about wealth as about appetite. You slice sparingly, adding tiny cubes to a stew so that everyone at the table feels like they tasted pig, even if it was mostly imagination. You think of the rhythms above ground. Autumn's harvest, frantic and noisy, turning into winter's quiet accounting. Each visit to the cellar is a prayer to arithmetic. How many onions remain? How many parsnips? Will the salted fish last until the thaw? You crouch in the dimness, fingers brushing a sack of beans, and realize that every bean is already part of a future story. February stew, March pottage, April miracle if you've rationed well. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants often starved outright in ordinary winters or whether true famines struck only in catastrophic harvest years. The truth lies in the grey. Many winters meant hunger, thin bodies, malnutrition. Starvation was the cliff, but hunger was the road. You sip the air of the cellar and understand. This is where the road begins or ends. You recall a trick your grandmother swore by, burying certain vegetables in sand inside barrels to keep them firm longer. It works. You pull out a turnip that feels almost fresh, its skin tight, its flesh still stubbornly crunchy. Ingenuity like that adds weeks of life to a cellar. A quirky little practice. Sometimes people packed apples with mint leaves to ward off spoilage, turning the cellar into a faintly perfumed orchard of desperation. You grin, at least your February snack came with aromatherapy. You glance up at the ceiling beams, dripping slightly in the damp air, and consider the danger of rodents. A mouse can devour the equivalent of a family's meal in a week, and you curse softly at the scuttling sound in the corner. Cats earn their keep here, prowling like furry accountants, ensuring the books stay balanced. The dog above may bark at strangers, but it's the cat's silent hunt that decides whether you still have beans in March. Joke 2. You picture pitching a reality show called Medieval Pantry Wars, where families compare whose root cellar smells the least like decomposing cabbage. Prize: 1 actual cabbage. You run your hands along the rows again, memorizing numbers: 10 onions, 20 parsnips, 2 sides of pork salted like bricks, and a barrel of fish that may or may not be edible. It isn't abundance, but it's rhythm. The cellar whispers, pace yourself, chew slowly, pray for an early spring. Back upstairs, you cover the trap door, sealing in both the food and the knowledge that your survival hangs on it. Outside, the wind is merciless. Inside, the cellar keeps its secrets in silence, waiting for you to return tomorrow and the day after, until either the snow retreats or the shelves empty. Historians still argue whether these little underground vaults were a communal sharing point or strictly guarded family property. Did neighbours knock and borrow, or did desperation turn everyone inward, protective of their roots and barrels? Either way, you know that this cellar is your treasury, your bank account, your insurance policy. You stroke your stomach, hear it growl faintly, and reassure it. Don't worry, we still have onions. Joke 3. You decide to rename the cellar the vault as if you're guarding medieval gold, when in truth it's a pile of wrinkled cabbages and a fish that looks like a medieval flip-flop. Still, to you, it's treasure enough. The bell finds you first, low and bronze and patient, rolling across the frozen fields like a sound wrapped in wool. You follow it because everyone follows it, boots scuffing the rime, breath ribboning ahead of you like a banner. The church rises out of the white like a grey ship, stones stacked upon stone, windows glazed with the thinnest glass your parish could afford, or else shuttered against the wind. You press a palm to the door, feel the sting of iron on your skin, and step into holy frost. Inside is colder than outside somehow. The stone keeps December as a house guest well into March, and your toes register their complaint against the flagstones with every step. You genuflect anyway. Habit moves faster than circulation, and you slide into a pew polished by generations of woolen cloaks. Your neighbour nods, cloak steaming faintly as his body learns the church is not interested in warmth. You pull your hood down, breath settling into the slow hush of prayer, incense barely lifting in the heavy air. The smoke is kinder than at home, resinous, honeyed, but still, that same cough flickers in your chest and then yields to the stillness. The bell quiets. The priest's voice rises, a steady thread in a room that wants to be silence. You let it draw you in, not because you catch every Latin word, but because the cadence is familiar, a metronome for winter thoughts. Here's your mainstream fact. Parish life anchors the medieval calendar and the church's year. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas tells you what to fast, what to sing, when to rest, when to kneel. If the fields are a wheel, the altar is the axle. You mark the weeks not by weather alone, but by feast days that land like stepping stones across the ice. You press your feet closer together, trying to convince them they're acquainted. A few women kneel on folded cloaks. A lucky elder sets a small straw mat down to bear. Gain with the cold. You shift and discover a dampness that implies last week's snow tracked in and never quite left. Joke 1. You consider proposing a new parish guild, the Brotherhood of Heated Floors. Then remember that miracles are technically above your pay grade. Candlelight trembles in the draughts, each flame narrowed to a pale spear. You know beeswax when you smell it, rich and clean, so you also know the parish saves it for the altar. The people get tallow with its friendly barnyard perfume. You nod toward the candles anyway because light is light and winter has been stingy with it. Candlemas approaches, February 2nd, a day you always meet with a sigh of relief, and the blessing of new candles will momentarily convince you that fire is on your side. Quirky tidbit. Tomorrow's throat blessing on St. Blaise's Day will use those very candles crossed at your neck while a prayer asks protection against coughs. You half wonder if the candles can talk to the smoke in your cottage and negotiate a truce. The sermon glides from the mystery of the season to the matter of your soul, and then, with a sigh you could time a clock by, to the matter of your tithe. God made the fields. The priest reminds you politely that the fields owe God 10%. You swallow, thinking of the onion braids you counted in the root cellar. Salvation is free. Parish roofing repairs are not. You've given in kind when coin was scarce. Sheaves in autumn, a piglet if the sow blessed you, a day of labour on the glebe. The calculation is as cold as the floor, but you keep your eyes soft. It's easier to pray with soft eyes. Bells mark more than Mass. They tell you when the sun sinks, when the curfew, couvre-feu, cover the fire, comes knocking, when a stranger wanders in, when a barn flares, when the Lord calls muster, when a wolf snatches a lamb at the edge of the wood. Sound is your village's messagey, Nang App. And the bell tower is the only account that never gets hacked. You remember last night's tolling and your careful hands banking the hearth under ash. You remember the way the cottage breathed. Easier once the embers settled. Peace, the priest says, and you pass it like a warm stone from palm to palm. Your fingers are rough, your neighbour's rougher. There's a whole biography in that handshake. Plough blisters, churn handle calluses, one crooked knuckle from a cart mishap. You catch the eye of the boy who watches the door for drafts and thieves. The same boy who fell asleep in first sleep on your straw mattress last night, the dog pinning his feet. He grins at you, hushed, wide, as if prayer is a joke you both get. Historians still argue whether lay people like you attended every Sunday dutifully or drifted in for high days and holy days, and whether distance, weather, and sheer exhaustion thinned the congregation more than surviving records admit. What the bell declares and what frozen feet obey may be two different ledgers. Today, though, the room is full. Winter bunches people together like sheep in a storm. When the fields rest, the soul gets called into account. A fragment of chant rises, and for a moment the stone learns to sing. You join in on the parts you know, hum on the parts you don't, and let the melody climb your ribs like a ladder. Music warms what coals can't. It's the one fire the church allows. You feel your shoulders loosen under the cloak, your jaw unclench its winter grip. Joke too. You promise yourself you'll request a livelier hymn next week, something with a beat that could thaw your toes. Then remind yourself that the 12th century doesn't take requests. Behind you, a child tugs a mother's sleeve. Ahead, someone crosses themselves slowly, fingers lingering as if trying to memorize the air. You think of the saints as extended family, Benedict for order, Nicholas for rough generosity, Blaise for throats, and let's be honest, for the coming cough. You've tucked a pinch of blessed salt into the door lintel at home, a domestic treaty wit. The invisible, and you plan to carry today's tiny candle stub back to relight the hearth with a scrap of the altar's courage. The offertory basket comes along, and you place a small onion and a promise, a day of ditch clearing when the thaw begins. The promise weighs as much as the onion. Work given to God feels lighter in the hand, even if your back will disagree later. The priest's blessing drifts over it all, Latin vowels like warm oil, and you are suddenly, acutely sleepy, the good kind, the kind that says the world can wait while your heartbeat evens out. You breathe slow and low, like you've been taught to do when the wind bullies your lungs outside. During the final prayer, you notice the holy water stoop crusted with a skim of ice. You touch it anyway, then press the cold to your forehead, waking yourself to the dismissal. Outside again, the bell gives a last soft note, as if bowing to you personally. The square is brighter than when you entered, and so are you, Hunger not solved, boots not drier, but a small thing inside you upright again, like a fence post reset after a storm. Neighbours mill and barter whispers. Someone mentions a widow whose roof lost its thatch in last night's gale. By afternoon, 5 of you will carry ladders and patches, and the dog will supervise with managerial gusto. Charity is not a theory in winter, it's lumber on a shoulder. The priest passes with a nod, boots soaked, the hem of his vestment flirting with puddles. You think of the altar's candles, of Candlemas, of the way a room changes when flames gather politely. You imagine tonight's cottage, your hearth coaxed with a sliver brought from church, and you feel an uncomplicated pleasure, light travelling, borrowed and shared like a story told twice. Joke 3, as you pull your hood up against a sudden gust, if holiness were measured by how many chilblains you collected kneeling or end stone, you'd be canonized by Shrove Tuesday. Alas, sanctity has other metrics, so you'll settle for warm bread and a candle stub. You turn homeward, bell fading behind you, frost glittering like quiet applause along the hedges. The fields are still iron, the sky still pewter, the road still stubborn. But your steps set a different rhythm now, one you can keep. The church didn't add degrees to the air, it added degrees to your resolve. You carry that like heat, tucked where no wind can reach. You leave the church square with its faint echo of bells and walk back through the village, hood low, boots crunching through half-frozen mud. The houses huddle against each other like gossiping old women, smoke curling from their roofs in lazy ribbons. But in the cracks between prayer and ploughing, people carry other tools, amulets, charms, muttered spells that travel no slower than the priest's Latin. Superstition lives here as naturally as frost, stitched into winter's very fabric. At the cottage door you see it first, a sprig of rowan tucked into the lintel, bright berries shriveled now but still defiant. Your neighbour swore it kept witches away, or at least confused them long enough to move on. You step inside, and someone whispers about hanging iron shears under the bed to ward off demons. A child fiddles with a pouch of herbs tied around his neck, a charm against fevers. Faith may command the calendar, but fear writes its own footnotes. Mainstream fact: medieval villagers blended Christian ritual with older folk practices, never quite abandoning charms, spells, or seasonal rites, even as priests thundered against them. In winter, when the cold pressed too close and hunger tapped the door, people leaned on anything that promised even a sliver of control. You recite the Paternoster 1 hour, tie a knotted string against toothache the next. Survival doesn't care about theology, it cares about creativity. You sit by the fire, tracing your finger along a wooden token carved with a crude figure. Maybe it's, say, Int Brigid. Maybe it's a household spirit. Either way, you keep it close when the snow moans through the roof timbers. You remember your aunt's story about laying bread on the doorstep for wandering souls. Whether it feeds the dead or just the neighbour's cat, who's to say? Joke 1. At least the cat is happy, and happy cats mean fewer mice in the root cellar, so maybe it's a saint in fur. Quirky tidbit. In parts of Europe, peasants smeared animal fat on door frames to keep evil spirits from slipping inside during the 12 days of Christmas. Picture it, your cottage doors greased like a medieval bakery, demons apparently thwarted by lard. You imagine one showing up, sniffing the doorframe and wandering off, muttering about cholesterol. Your cousin stirs the embers and mentions the will-o'-the-wisps said to haunt the marsh at the forest edge. Don't follow the lights, she warns. Everyone nods solemnly, even though none of you has ever actually seen them. But fear has gravity. It keeps children inside when wolves howl, keeps wanderers tethered to paths they might otherwise risk. Historians still argue whether these tales were pure invention or echoes of natural phenomena, gas in the marsh, reflections on the snow. Either way, the stories stick like burrs on wool. You rub your palms, still cold, and think of the annual rituals that mix prayer and superstition. On Epiphany, you chalk the door with initials to keep misfortune away. On New Year's, you slip a coin into the bread dough for luck. On cold nights like this, you mutter a rhyme taught by your grandmother, her voice still woven into the words. Is it holy? Is it pagan? You're not sure. It's simply part of winter's grammar. The dog stirs and growls at nothing. Everyone freezes, eyes darting to the dark corner. A draft? A mouse? Or something worse? Someone spits 3 times for protection. Another throws salt on the fire. The moment passes, but you feel the weight of invisible company. This is what winter does. It magnifies every creak, every shadow, every whisper. Cold isn't the only enemy. It's loneliness dressed up as spirits. You glance at the rafters where a dried horse skull watches with hollow eyes. Your grandfather hung it there years ago, swearing it kept evil out. Maybe it's just tradition, maybe it's just theatre, but tonight you're oddly grateful for the horse's silent vigil. Joke 2. You consider giving it a name, something cheerful like Sir Nasalot, to make the rafters feel less judgmental. The hearth flares briefly as someone tosses a bundle of herbs into the flames. The scent rises, sharp, medicinal, almost pleasant. Protection, they say. Maybe the smoke drives away spirits. Maybe it drives away fleas. Either way, you breathe deeper, letting the scent replace the musty damp in your nose. A child whispers a story about spirits that lick frost from the window panes, leaving patterns like tongues on glass. Everyone chuckles nervously. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers genuinely believed in these charms or simply clung to them as habits, just in case. Was it faith, fear, or cultural inertia? You can debate it all you like, but when the nights are long and the food is low, belief becomes insulation. You don't have to prove it, you just have to survive it. Joke 3. You imagine future historians writing about your own rituals. Peasants believed that staring into glowing rectangles called phones warded off boredom demons, and decide maybe you're not so different after all. You settle by the hearth, clutching the carved token, watching the smoke curl like phantom fingers toward the rafters. Outside, the snow falls heavy. Inside, superstition and faith knit together into a blanket as real as wool. You pull it around your shoulders, not because you're certain it works, but because certainty is a luxury and hope is enough. You stand at the edge of the village where the last fence post leans drunkenly toward the snow-laden woods. The forest crouches there like a waiting beast, dark, impenetrable, alive with noises that make your stomach tighten. Daylight has a way of painting the trees as friendly, a pantry full of wood and berries. But at night, you swear the shadows have teeth. You squint, and every snapped twig, every rustle, every echo of your own breath might be something watching you back. The elders remind you often, keep to the path. Winter isn't just cold, it's opportunistic, and nothing embodies that threat more than wolves. Mainstream fact, wolf packs were common across medieval Europe, and during particularly harsh winters they ventured close to villages, desperate for livestock, sometimes desperate enough to menace people. Chroniclers even recorded entire hunts organized to thin wolf numbers, a community effort where men armed with spears and torches tried to scare back the night. You imagine yourself gripping a torch, heart pounding, as dozens of glowing eyes blink just beyond the firelight. But wolves are only half the story. In the cold dark, folklore fills the rest. Quirky tidbit, some peasants swore wolves weren't just wolves at all, but could be shapeshifters, cursed men wandering in fur, driven by hunger beyond human measure. Stories spread of werewolves punished by God, doomed to roam on all fours until some saint took pity. Did people believe it literally? Maybe. Did they whisper it while clutching their children tighter at bedtime? Absolutely. You tug your cloak closer, crunching through the snow at the tree line to check the traps. The forest groans around you, each gust of wind like a low growl. You glance back at the village, its fires barely visible, and mutter a prayer under your breath, not for salvation exactly, but for an uneventful evening. Joke 1. You promise yourself that if you make it back in one piece, you'll compose a new village law. Mandatory torches after sunset, no exceptions, even for tough guys. You kneel to inspect a snare, empty, just snow packed down where a rabbit should have been. You wonder if the wolf got it first. Hunger here isn't just yours, it's every creature's. And tonight you feel yourself listed somewhere on the menu. You move quickly, breath sharp in your lungs. The forest smells of pine, damp bark, and something muskier, animal. You can't tell if it's deer, fox, or something bigger, and you don't particularly want to. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers feared wolves primarily as real predators or as symbols, stand-ins for sin, greed, or chaos beyond the reach of civilization. Maybe both. To you, standing here in the dark, the distinction feels academic. A symbol doesn't leave paw prints this wide in the snow. You pause. At the tree line, two eyes catch your torchlight, glinting gold-green, then vanish with a blink. Your chest tightens. The silence afterward is worse than the growl you expected. You take a step back, torch raised higher, and remember the advice. Don't run, don't scream. Wolves respect strength, or so the hunters claim. You mutter again, words spilling out in a jumble of Latin half-remembered from Mass, and charms your grandmother taught you, just in case. Survival doesn't care which works, as long as something does. The dog at your side stiffens, hackles raised. You grip your staff harder. Joke 2, you whisper. If this turns into a fight, you get the ears, I get the tail. But the dog is too tense to laugh. And then, the sound of padding feet, faint but deliberate. You swing the torch, and the shadows scatter like guilty children. Maybe it was a fox, maybe it was more. You'll never know. But you've reminded yourself why the forest is respected, feared, and endlessly talked about by the fire. The line between survival and prey is only as thick as your torch flame. You hurry back toward the village, the dog trotting faster now, both of you pretending you're not fleeing. The cottages rise into view, their smoke suddenly the sweetest sight you've ever seen. You glance over your shoulder once more. The trees loom, silent and watchful, their secrets tucked under snow. Inside the cottage again, your neighbours lean in as you recount what you saw. The children gasp, the old men nod knowingly, and someone swears they heard wolves too, just last week, howling the moon. The story grows legs as you tell it, weaving into the larger fabric of winter fears. Historians still argue whether wolves truly threatened humans often, or if chroniclers exaggerated. But tonight, your hands are still shaking, and you decide exaggeration doesn't matter. Fear has teeth, whether or not they leave scars. Joke 3. You declare the forest committee officially dissolved until spring because anyone volunteering to check traps at night deserves sainthood, or at least an extra loaf of bread. The laughter is nervous, but it warms the room. You set the torch down, breathe deep of the smoky air, and let your heart slow. Outside, the tree line sways gently, indifferent. The wolves, or whatever shadows carried those eyes, remain out there, waiting. You, however, are in here, alive, your breath still steaming, your body still whole. For now, that's victory enough. Your heart still pounds from the forest watch, but dawn has no sympathy for fear. The first pale light seeps through the cracks in the shutters, and already your body knows what must happen. Work, even in the cold. You step outside and the frost crunches under your boots like brittle glass. The plough, leaned against the barn, looks like a relic buried in rime. The handles are cracked, the iron share rusted. And even if you had the strength to drag it into the field, the earth is a frozen anvil that laughs at your effort. Still, chores don't pause just because the soil does. You push at the wheelbarrow, its wooden joints groaning like an old man's knees. A cartwheel splits from the cold, the iron rim contracting and popping free of the hub. You curse softly, nothing blasphemous, just the peasant's litany of winter. Of course, today. Repairs are constant, but in the cold, everything feels brittle, from the wood to your patience. Mainstream fact: medieval farming tools were simple. Wooden ploughs tipped with iron, scythes, carts, and winter made them stubborn. Iron could snap if strained in freezing weather, and wood split easily without proper care. Families spent much of winter sharpening blades, oiling metal, and mending handles so that when the thaw came, they'd be ready. It wasn't idleness, it was a slow, cold workshop season. You fetch a bucket of water to soften wood for repair, only to find the top frozen solid. You jab it with a stick until the ice cracks, the shards floating like broken glass. Your reflection in the water looks pale, gaunt, a little older than you feel. You shake it off, dragging the bucket back to the tool shed. The smell of damp hay and old iron greets you like an old dog. A quirky tidbit surfaces in your memory. Some peasants tried to keep carts in use by greasing the axles with animal fat, a medieval WD-40. You picture yourself rubbing goose fat into the wheel joints, muttering, "Stay smooth, old friend." If nothing else, at least the cart smells faintly of dinner. Joke 1. You decide to market it as all-natural organic lubricant, centuries ahead of your time. Your hands stiffen on the handles of the axe as you split wood for the hearth. Each swing is an argument with the frost, every log splintering into kindling a tiny victory. Your shoulders burn, your breath clouds, and soon your nose drips as relentlessly as the thaw you wish for. You glance toward the children hauling bundles of twigs, their arms wrapped tight around each bundle like treasure. This is winter's true crop, not wheat or barley, but fuel. Historians still argue whether peasants dreaded winter more for the hunger or the work it demanded despite the hunger. The evidence leans both ways. In good years, families might rest more, mending nets, weaving cloth. In hard years, they laboured even harder, scavenging wood, carrying water, patching thatch, every hour a fight to keep their homes upright. You heft another log onto the pile and feel both truths digging into your muscles. Your neighbour trudges past, shoulders bowed under a broken hoe. He nods toward you, muttering that he'll spend the afternoon refitting the handle with a fresh ash branch. Tools weren't disposable. Each one was patched, reforged, reshaped, sometimes lasting generations. You realize your plowshare might have been your grandfather's, sharpened and resharpened until it resembles more memory than metal. Joke 2. You consider carving your initials into the plow, not as vanity, but as a warning. This idiot kept breaking it. Please be kinder next time. You smile at the thought, even as your hands ache from cold. The field beyond the barn is useless for planting, but you trudge to it anyway, stamping down snow so it doesn't crush the hedges. You check the fences for weak posts, tapping each one with your staff. A loose fence means hungry livestock wandering into deeper woods where wolves remember their appetite. You patch the gaps with brushwood, fingers numb but quick. Every fence is a boundary against both hunger and fear. You pause, wiping your nose on your sleeve, and look over the whitened land. It's beautiful in its cruelty. A white sheet stretched tight across the earth. You imagine the furrows hidden underneath, seeds long harvested, waiting to be born again in spring. Your body itches for that rhythm, to dig, to sow, to see green. But winter keeps you in maintenance mode. Back at the shed, you hang your tools carefully because losing one in snow could mean disaster. You run a hand along the axe head, whispering a small thanks for its cooperation. Then you glance toward the barn, where the cow lows impatiently. Tools may freeze, but animals wait for no season. Historians still argue whether peasants saw winter as rest or punishment, as necessary rhythm or cruel interruption. To you, standing here with cracked hands and an empty stomach, it feels like both. A pause in planting, yes, but filled with the relentless maintenance of everything else. Joke 3. You mutter that if you survive till spring, you'll invent a tool that sharpens and repairs itself. You'll call it the miracle hoe, and the church will probably ban it as witchcraft. But oh, the time it would save. You shoulder the last bundle of wood, stack it near the door, and stretch your stiff back. The frost has bitten your fingers raw, but the hearth tonight will thank you. Broken ploughs, frozen buckets, cracked wheels. Winter tries to dismantle your world one tool at a time. Your job is simply to keep patching, keep swinging, keep holding it all together until the thaw comes. And so you do, with splinters in your palms and stubbornness in your chest. The road that yesterday felt like a sentence now feels like a surprise. Ribbons of footprints, carts creaking, laughter sliding across the frost as if the cold itself had decided to take the day off. You follow the swarm toward the green, winter brown, where stalls sprout like wooden mushrooms and pennants snap in the wind. A winter fair. Barter first, cheer second, but both arrive together, hitching their coats to the same bell rope. Your breath fogs as you step into the bustle, and the noise warms you faster than any hearth ever could. A piper starts near the stocks, squeezing a tune that sounds suspiciously like last summer's harvest song, wearing a woolen hat. Children chase the melody, boots scattering powdery snow. The dog you know by reputation, equal parts sheriff and beggar, patrols for dropped meat pies that exist mostly in legend. The smell hits you in layers: smoke, tallow, wet wool, and somewhere, blessedly, honey. Your stomach perks up like a cat hearing a cupboard open. A woman with clever hands holds out a tray of ginger biscuits browned to the edge of courage. You trade a thumb length of yarn you spun by the hearth for two, and they crumble into warmth on your tongue, a small applause of spice you pretend not to notice is mostly imagination. Mainstream fact: such fairs don't appear from nowhere. They arrive from charters and saints' days, lords and abbeys asserting the right to hold markets, to take tolls, to invite traders under safe conduct. The calendar's heavy with holy markers: Martinmas, Nicholas, Epiphany, and around them, villages unfreeze briefly into commerce. You hand over a humble token at the gate, a toll that buys order, and a guard who looks cold enough to convert to any religion promising mittens. You drift to the cloth stall where bolts of coarse wool lean like sleepy oxen. The colours are winter straight: mud, ash, sheep, with a few bragging strips of madder red draped like tongues of fire. You finger a remnant and imagine it as a new hood, one that won't leak snow down your collar on the walk back from church. The spinner behind the table eyes your calluses exactly the way you eyed her thread count. You trade a string of dried apples and a promise to help mend her fence when the thaw comes. The promise feels extravagant, but then so does the idea of a hood that doesn't drip. A juggler occupies a circle of trampled snow, tossing 3 wooden balls and 1 turnip that has seen better autumns. You laugh despite yourself, a brief, unguarded sound you haven't made since Candlemas candles were first blessed. Joke 1. You consider applying to apprentice as a juggler. Then imagine yourself dropping the turnip into the reeve's lap and decide your current career in not starving is challenging enough. Somewhere, a pot of ale warmed with a sly pinch of something aromatic steams like a small cauldron of optimism. Not quite the luxury of imported spices, but whoever dropped in a clove deserves knighthood. You trade a spoon of butter, liquid gold in January, for a little wooden cup. It tastes like someone taught winter to be polite for a minute. The alewife's cheeks are the pink of honest work, and she shouts prices over the wind as if convincing the air itself to buy a pint. At a table of metal odds and ends, your hand pauses over a bundle of nails. Nails are like time, always in deficit. The smith's son demonstrates a strap that might tame your rebellious cartwheel. You picture the wheel that leapt off yesterday and decide to spend a sliver of precious coin. It's either this or inventing square wheels as a statement piece. Quirky tidbit. The boy offers a sliver of sin, jing wire, a twisted strand he swears scares away evil if plucked near the door. You half trust it, you half know he made the claim last week about a completely different piece of metal. You buy it anyway, because sometimes protection is a sound you choose. Music swells near the churchyard wall, fiddles, a drum, the scraping joy of boots on ice. A small pond at the green's edge has frozen flat, and youths skim across it on strapped bone skates, pushing with poles like swans who read the wrong instruction manual. You watch them glide and stumble, their laughter ricocheting off the cold like thrown pennies. For a moment you picture yourself out there, a bone blade tied to your shoe, wind in your hood, dignity on the line. Joke 2, you announce silently that your ankle bones already pay too much rent to your daily chores. You'll dance on dirt later. Beneath a canvas sheet, a tinker shows kettles bright enough to see a ghost of your cheek in. He speaks fast, a tide of promises, fewer scorch marks, less soot, more soup. You don't quite believe him, but the idea of a pot that doesn't add grit to the pottage makes you light-headed with ambition. A small brass ladle, cheap, dented, finds its way into your hands as if born there. You trade a slab of salted herring and a mended glove, and somehow both of you feel you won. That's winter magic. Convincing yourself a fair trade is a feast. Historians still argue whether peasants like you travelled far to winter fairs, risking wolves, ice, and the Lord's temper, or mostly kept to local markets, letting larger chartered fairs serve merchants and guilds. Distance, weather, and what waited in your root cellar all argued their case. Today, the village itself has decided for you. The fair arrived within walking reach, and even your cautious neighbour came along, muttering that he'd only look. He now carries a string of onions, like a trophy. A mummer's troop lurches into view, bells on shins, paper crowns, a hobby horse with a grin both foolish and unsettling. The play is half-remembered legend and half-improvised gossip. St. George fights a dragon that oddly resembles the Lord's new mastiff, and the healer resurrects him with a bottle suspiciously labelled Doctor's Ale. You shout the correct lines when prompted and cheer when the dragon sulks off to scrounge pastry. The children go feral with delight. It's thin theatre and thick joy, which is exactly the ratio you can afford. The reeve strides past with a tally stick, thinner-lipped than usual, reminding stallholders about dues. You duck instinctively, the peasant's reflex for avoiding extra arithmetic. Sumptuary laws drift through the fair like a draft. You may look but not look too fine, you may buy but not buy beyond your rank. You mostly ignore them. Warmth trumps statute. Still you tuck the red remnant under your cloak the way a child hides a sweet. You barter news as hard as goods. Who has grain, who lost a cow to the cold, who found a cache of onions behind a collapsed wall as if a saint had stashed them for later. Some stories are true, some true adjacent, all of them welcome. You pass along the trick of burying turnips in sand, receive in return the advice to bank coals under ash with a bit of twig net to keep the embers cosy. The fair is a university with no tuition and many goats. By afternoon, your hands remember warmth, your face has learned a new posture called smiling, and your pockets carry proof of competence. Nails, a strap, a twist of thread, the brass ladle, and a stub of beeswax. The candlemaker slipped you when you admired his altar-bound stock too long. For your hearth, he said, and it felt like a blessing. Joke 3. You declare the bees honorary parishioners and promise them a pew come spring. On the edge of the stalls, an old woman sells stories for the price of listening. She tells of winters when the river froze so hard carts crossed as if earth had grown a second spine. You don't know whether to believe her, but you file it next to the will-o'-the-wisps and the horse skull. Useful, uncertain, warming in the telling. You hand her one of your ginger biscuits. She accepts it like an oath. Dusk folds the fare as neatly as cloth back on a bolt. Pennants droop, the piper pockets his tune, and bodies turn toward doorways. You tighten your new strap around the stubborn wheel and feel the cart obey, as if impressed by your day of negotiations. The air cools to a sharper note, and the scent of hot broth leaking from cottages strikes you as a more persuasive sermon than anything delivered at a pulpit. You head home with your little hoard, steps bolder, shoulders higher, heart remembering its easier shape. By the time you lift the latch, the fare has settled into memory exactly where you need it. A pocket-sized summer you can unfold on hunger days. Tomorrow will give you porridge again, tools again, smoke again, but tonight you add to the bowl a shred of red cloth, a brass glint, a crumb of music, and a rumour that winter too likes to laugh when no one's looking. You hold that rumour close, the way you once held a warmed stone under blankets, and let it radiate through the room until even the dog looks convinced. The fare's laughter still lingers in your ears when the reeve appears the next morning, his cloak rimmed with frost, tally stick in hand. Winter might let you bargain for ginger biscuits, but it never excuses you from feudal dues, even as snow buries the fields, even when your barns echo hollow. The Lord expects his cut. You clutch your cloak tighter, not against the cold, but against the slow, familiar dread of obligations that outlive harvests. Mainstream fact: peasants owed rent, labour, and tithes year-round, not just during fertile months. The manorial system demanded dues in grain, livestock, or days of work on the Lord's domain. Winter offered no pardon. The calendar turned, and so did the Lord's steward, quill and parchment sharp as any scythe. You hand over what you can, a measure of barley, a sack of beans, perhaps a day's work hauling timber from the frozen forest. The reeve scratches a notch into his tally stick, a wooden account of lives bent under duty. The irony bites almost as hard as the wind. You're hungry, but you give grain. Your tools are broken, but you spend days repairing his fences. Your hands are raw, but they lift his timber. Joke 1. You mutter under your breath that if heaven has a manorial system, you'll stage a peasant revolt by the pearly gates. And yet, as much as you resent it, the system is the air you breathe. The Lord's men patrol the forest paths, sometimes keeping wolves at bay. The manor mill grinds your grain, at a fee, but still. His granaries, stocked better than yours, might offer emergency bread when famine digs too deep. You resent the yoke, but you also know the yoke keeps the cart from splintering. Survival, again, is arithmetic. Quirky tidbit. In some regions, peasants paid part of their dues with boon work, mandatory labour days that could fall even in the dead of winter. Imagine trudging through knee-deep snow to clear ditches or cart stones for the Lord's new hall, your stomach rumbling like a half-empty drum. You joke with fellow labourers, share a flask of thin ale, and wonder how many saints actually keep track of frozen blisters. You glance at the church tower, remembering that tithes belong there too. 1/10 of your harvest, 1/10 of your stock, 1/10 of your patience. The priest speaks of salvation while noting your missing onions with the precision of a bookkeeper. Faith is free, you remind yourself, but candles and roof repairs are not. Historians still argue whether tithes and dues left peasants perpetually impoverished, or whether careful households managed a slim margin of comfort. The truth sits in your belly tonight, grumbling after thin porridge. The margin is thinner than ice in April. Still, community finds ways to lighten the burden. At the fair, neighbours whispered of pooling resources, trading beans for wood, wood for cloth, cloth for onions, so that no single Reeves visit drained one house dry. It isn't rebellion, just redistribution with a wink. And sometimes, when the steward isn't looking, a jug of ale travels from your hearth to his, and suddenly your missing sack of oats is forgiven. Corruption, charity, survival, it all blurs when the snow piles high. You watch as your neighbour struggles with her dues, offering eggs from hens that barely lay in winter. The Reeve frowns but takes them, notching his stick anyway. She sighs with relief and exhaustion. You offer to mend her cart in exchange for some straw later. It's a quiet pact, these neighbourly trades, survival's hidden ledger. Joke 2. You imagine inventing a medieval loyalty card. Pay 10 tithes, get 1 free confession. But the priest would likely excommunicate you before you finish drawing the first stamp. Back at your cottage, you count what remains in the root cellar after paying dues. The numbers shrink, the days stretch, and you feel that old ache in your ribs. But you also feel a kind of grim triumph. You paid, you survived the Reeves' cold eyes, you live another day. Sometimes victory is just notching your own stick. Alive, alive, alive. Historians still argue whether peasants truly despised their lords or simply accepted the bargain as immutable. Some chronicles whisper of revolts, brief and fiery. Others show centuries of steady submission. You, standing in the frost with a calloused palm, know both truths, resentment and dependence, rebellion and obedience, all folded into one cloak you wear because you must. You sit by the fire that evening, shoulders slumped, and imagine spring. Fields thawing, grains sprouting, obligations renewed. The wheel turns endlessly. You thin of the tally sticks. One for the Reeve, one for the priest, one invisible but carved into your bones by hunger. And you wonder, briefly, whether spring will pay its debts to you as faithfully as you've paid yours to everyone else. Joke 3. You raise your cup of ale and toast the tally stick itself. To the real lord of the manor, may you get eaten by mice. The laughter is tired, but it's laughter, and in winter that's worth as much as bread. You wake to the sound that really runs the village. Not bells, not wolves, not even your own stomach, but the soft percussion of women already moving. Before the horizon bothers to blush, there's the thud of kneading on a board, the hush of skirts against straw, the wet slap of water poured into the pot, the low tick of a spindle beginning its day-long song. You stretch, pretending you'll help in a minute, and then you remember you are part of this orchestra now, drawn into a rhythm that mothers, wives, daughters, widows, and grandmothers keep so steady the winter itself keeps time by it. You step into the half-light, and the room's been rearranged by labour, the last embers you banked under ash. She coaxed them before you stirred, turning your maybe of warmth into a working flame. Pottage? It's not a miracle. It's her hand already slicing onion skins paper thin, measuring barley with an eye so practiced she could do it in her sleep. Sometimes she does. Somewhere between first sleep and second, when you'd swear you saw her sitting up to mend in the dark. You hand her the ladle like a squire offers a lance, and she doesn't even look up. She's counting in root cellar numbers and prayer bead patience. Mainstream fact, across medieval Europe, women's work anchored survival, spinning wool and flax, washing and fulling cloth, brewing small ale, churning butter, tending kitchen gardens, salting and smoking meats, and managing the ceaseless economy of hearth and child. The distaff side wasn't a metaphor, it was the daily reality of a spindle always turning, threads snaking into baskets like tame winter lightning. The village's textile engine is built on calloused fingers and a spindle whirring beside the fire while stories circle the room. She lifts the pot so the porridge doesn't catch, and you catch yourself thinking again how the taste of winter is mostly the taste of her pee. Atience. Yesterday's heel of bread becomes today's trencher under her hands. Tomorrow's broth steals flavour from bones she saved in a cloth like treasure. And when your wool hood sheds snow down your neck for the 20th time, she's already cut the red fair remnant into a patch that persuades the leek to think twice. Your idea of repair is a strap on a cartwheel. Hers is an invisible seam that saves you from pneumonia. Water doesn't fetch itself. You shoulder the bucket today and the path bites your ankles with little teeth of ice. She does this walk a dozen times a week, hips steady, steps economical, mind already in 3 places, garden plan, barley measure, whether the ale has soured. Joke 1, you swear the bucket got heavier just to impress her. It's the only audience winter has. Back inside, she flips the linen on the line stringing across the rafters, and the cottage fills with a faintly alchemical smell. Bleach before bleach was a word. Quirky tidbit. Lant, stale urine saved in a crock, helps whiten and scour linen once it's been washed and beaten. Not charming, but effective. You make a face. She shrugs. Winter doesn't grade methods, only results. The sheets will feel cleaner than the air, which is saying something in a smoke-choked house. There's the churn too, shoulders set, rhythm measured, butter coaxed from winter milk as if sunshine could be convinced to change state. And when the cow's temper sours, she's the whisperer who gets the halter over the head without a fight. Who knows which handful of hay opens a bovine heart? The calf coughs, she hears it before you do. The hen's laying slows, she adjusts feed and nest as if negotiating with a tiny god. Historians still argue whether women's legal and economic agency in the countryside was broad or narrow. Did widows regularly manage strips in the open fields, hire ploughmen and bargain at market? Or did most women's control stop at the threshold, their labour invisible in manorial records? The truth follows hearth smoke, everywhere. Then gone, then everywhere again. You've watched widows strike. Harder bargains than any reeve. You've also watched a daughter's skilled hands vanish behind her husband's name on a tally stick. Your mind flickers to the ale. Before guilds and city statutes shouldered them aside in many places, women brewed the village's daily drink, measuring mash and boil with the same instinct they use for soup. Alewives, they're called, and not always kindly. When a batch turns, tongues do too. But when winter gnaws, her clean brew is a blessing measured in sips. You raise a cup, and she raises an eyebrow that says, "Don't you dare treat calories I conjured as sport." The spindle keeps humming. You try it, carefully, and produce a lumpy snake of yarn that looks like it lost an argument with a hedgehog. She takes it gently, not to shame but to rescue, twirling the spindle with the flick of fingers that seem to know gravity personally. Thread piles up like stored heat. Wool becomes warp and weft, socks that actually stay on, a nightcap that pins warmth where it tries to escape. Remember the warmed stone at your feet? She wrapped that too, with cloth she wove last summer, while you were trying to convince the fence to be less philosophical about its purpose. There's medicine in her apron pocket, a twist of yarrow, a scrap of plantain, dried elderflowers, a salve that smells of tallow and something green. The child's cough meets a honeyed spoon. The old man's joints get a rub like a prayer smoothed into the skin. She can read fevers the way you read sky, counting the steps between breath and danger. If the herbs fail, she knows the midwife's steps by sound alone. The village doesn't list doctor among its winter staff. It lists her. Joke 2. You propose awarding her a feast day. Saint keeps everyone alive, complete with candles, bread, and absolutely no dishes afterward. She smirks and hands you a stack of bowls. She is also auditor and archivist. When the reeve arrives with that tally stick, she's already counted the onions 3 ways, knows exactly how much barley you can spare without turning Lent into lamentation. She can smile a steward into mercy or scare him with numbers. Either way, you eat next week because she refused to be surprised by an empty bin. She's the village encryption. Nothing leaves this house without passing through her hands. At night, when bodies braid under wool and the cow sighs by the door, she is not finished. The day's thread becomes a small braid of hope tied around tomorrow's chores. The last cups get rinsed. The banked coals get tucked the way she tucked the baby earlier, ash smoothed like a blanket. The dog, self-appointed manager, waits for a scrap. She lines up bones like tiny treaties with hunger. Between first sleep and second you stir and see her silhouette, bent over a tear in the cloak, stitches small and steady as hail. You whisper that it can wait. She doesn't answer. The thread is mid-sentence. Mainstream or micro, the world learns her shape. Doors she greased with tallow don't moan when the wind insists. The thatch she patched last week no longer weeps over the bed. The path she swept of ice saves 2 ankles a day. The baby she rocked last night is the child eating this morning. Your jokes, your fears, your big ideas about inventing miracle hose, none of them produce soup. Her hands do. Joke 3. You announce that if kings truly wanted loyalty, they'd decree a national nap hour for women every afternoon. The idea is magnificent and doomed. Still, imagining it warms the room. On feast days you'll see the other evidence. The ribbon tied just so, the clean linen that somehow got dried in a week of weather that never met the concept of dry, the cloak turned inside out to hide a stain, the child's hair braided into something that looks like a saint's patience learning. Geometry. When the choir drones, her voice carries a thread of melody that the cold can't flatten. Afterward, she trades a recipe for keeping leeks perky with a neighbour. Offers accepts a pinch of mint to pack with apples, conjures a plan to patch the widow's roof by week's end. Historians still argue whether we romanticize this labour in hindsight, smoothing calluses into poetry and hard choices into ingenuity. You decide the debate can circle the square without you. What you know is this: the porridge tastes like someone loved you enough to get up earlier. The hearth burns because someone refused to let it die. The cow stands calm because someone sings to it in winter's key. You sit at day's end, spine uncoiling, and watch her finally settle. Spindle stilled, hands quiet, eyes lowering like shutters. You want to say something large and ceremonial. Instead, you pass the warmed stone down the bed, the one she wrapped, the one that remembers fire as it cools. She tucks it at her feet and exhales for what feels like the first time all day. It's a small rite, but it's shared, and it says what your throat can't quite hold. Without her, winter wins. The cottage exhales steam from its roof as if sighing under the weight of another frozen dawn. Inside, children stir, their hair static with sleep, eyes gummy from the smoke, yet spirits already darting faster than their bodies can keep up. Hunger has trained them to wake alert, not with groans, but with the restless rhythm of survival. You glance at them and wonder, how do small bodies hold so much resilience in so little skin? A boy pulls his tunic over his head, the hem stiff with yesterday's frost. He grins anyway, slapping his arms together to coax circulation, then launches into a game where his toes are knights fighting an ice dragon beneath the blanket. His sister giggles, clutching a carved stick she swears is a magic wand, chasing shadows on the wall. The games don't stop the hunger, but they distract from it, which is almost the same thing. Joke 1. You wonder whether historians will one day catalogue blanket dragon as the greatest medieval sport never entered into Olympic records. Mainstream fact: children were woven into the fabric of survival from the start. They fetched water, gathered kindling, herded geese, and later helped in the fields. But in winter, when ploughs slept and earth froze, their tasks shifted, watching animals, mending nets, spinning wool with clumsy hands. Small chores, yes, but each one meant a little less strain on exhausted adults. And all the while, they learned how to recognize a healthy turnip, how to tell good thread from bad, how to bank a fire. Childhood was shorter here, not by choice, but by necessity. Yet a quirky tidbit: some medieval households carved toys from scraps of wood, little horses, dolls with linen dresses, even miniature carts. Archaeologists have unearthed them, humble playthings carried through centuries of soil. You picture one in a child's hand now, a wooden horse galloping across straw, neighing with a voice pitched somewhere between laughter and defiance. It's a reminder, even when the belly grumbles, imagination refuses to hibernate. The older children shuffle into their roles. A girl, barely 10, ties on an apron and helps stir the pottage, her hands mimicking her mother's, even though her arms tremble from the weight of the spoon. A boy trudges outside with a bucket to break the ice in the trough for the cow, his fingers red with cold. You follow him, offering advice he already knows by heart, but he nods dutifully anyway. His breath plumes in the air, and you think not for the first time that winter carves adulthood fast. Historians still argue whether medieval parents were emotionally distant from their children, expecting high mortality to dull affection, or whether bonds were as fierce as any time in history. Evidence is patchy: records of baptisms and burials, lullabies preserved in manuscripts, a carved toy horse. But here, in the flicker of the hearth, you see no debate. Parents wrap arms around coughing children, share the warmest place in bed, and whisper stories about saints and sprites until eyelids fall. Love is practical, yes, but also palpable. The children sit in a circle, their voices spilling stories they've heard 100 times. The boy insists he saw wolf tracks near the stream. The girl swears she glimpsed will-o'-the-wisps in the snow. The younger ones widen their eyes, shivering half in fear, half in delight. Fear, like hunger, is transformed by play. You listen, nodding gravely, because you know the ritual. Stories are winter's toys, shaping nights into something less cruel. Joke 2. One boy lifts a stick like a sword and declares himself Lord of the Snowbank. You laugh and remind him that he still owes feudal dues, 2 turnips and 3 chores before bedtime. He groans dramatically, collapsing into the straw like a fallen knight. Later the children beg to go outside, their energy spilling over the low walls. You relent, pulling cloaks tight, sending them into the snow's blinding glare. They throw themselves into drifts, carving angels and monsters with flailing limbs, rolling balls until their hands sting. They shout challenges, their voices echoing through the crisp air like bells. The game is short-lived. The cold eventually seeps through, but for a moment the snow is not enemy, but playground. You watch, smiling faintly, as they invent games with sticks and stones, races across icy paths, contests to see who can carry the heaviest log without slipping. Weizen. Ear laughter makes the frost less sharp, their cries stitching warmth into the air. You remember being that small, your world bounded by hedgerows and hearth smoke, your greatest treasure, a pebble polished by the stream. Hunger didn't vanish then either, but it was easier to ignore when pretending to be a knight, a saint, or even a wolf. Inside again, cheeks flushed, they crowd the hearth, hands thrust toward the flames. One child lifts the warmed stone that serves as a foot warmer in bed, giggling as if it's a magical treasure. Another gnaws at a crust of bread, gnashing teeth theatrically, announcing that they're chewing through a dragon bone. You nod solemnly. After all, in their story, the crust is dragon bone, and in winter, imagination stretches meals further than barley does. Historians still argue whether medieval children truly experienced childhood as a distinct stage or were seen merely as miniature adults. The truth, you decide, is messy. They work, they play, they suffer, they dream. They braid flax clumsily one moment and battle snow dragons the next. And though the world presses them into labour early, it doesn't erase their laughter. It just weaves it into chores until you can't tell where necessity ends and play begins. Joke 3. When one boy proudly announces that he'll grow up to be king, you pat his head and say, "Good, then you can cancel my taxes." He beams, utterly convinced, and for a second you let yourself believe it too. Night settles, and the children coil into bed like a pile of kittens, breath rising and falling in unison. Their dreams are likely full of dragons, saints, and sleds, far removed from hunger's arithmetic. You lie beside them, listening to their soft murmurs, and realize that in this season of scarcity, their resilience is its own harvest. Winter teaches them early, but it also gives them games, stories, and a fierce gourds, ill to laugh in the face of frost. And that laughter, fragile though it seems, carries you too. The night presses heavy, and though your body aches for straw and blanket, your eyes stay sharp. Tonight is your turn for watch. The storehouse squats near the village edge, a rough timber hut with its own heartbeat, the creak of beams, the sigh of settling sacks. Inside lie beans, onions, salted fish, and the last crumbs of hope. You sling your cloak tighter, grip the staff with both hands, and plant yourself near the door like a stubborn tree refusing to bend in the wind. Mainstream fact: theft in medieval villages wasn't rare, especially in winter. Hunger could transform even neighbours into trespassers. Grain stores were guarded, sometimes by rotation, sometimes by locks, crude but persuasive. A missing sack of barley wasn't just loss, it was a week of meals gone. To steal food in January was to gamble with another family's survival, and the village knew it. Punishments could be brutal, but desperation whispered louder than fear. The wind prowls, rattling shutters and tugging at your hood. Your torch flickers, throwing long shadows across the snow. A dog pads beside you, ears pricked, tail stiff with attention. You murmur a reassurance, though your own pulse is quick. Wolves aren't the only predators here. You've heard the stories. Men caught with hands in bins, women smuggling loaves beneath skirts, children sent to crawl through gaps in walls, sometimes caught, sometimes not. Everyone pretends to be shocked, but everyone understands. You stamp your feet, trying to chase the numbness creeping upward from your toes. A quirky tidbit drifts into memory. Some villages scattered thorns or brambles outside granary doors so that intruders couldn't approach silently. You glance at the rough hedge woven around your post, sharp as a hedge of spite. Step wrong, and it hisses your crime before you even start. Joke 1. You decide that if you ever fall into the thorns yourself, you'll claim you were just testing security protocols. The silence presses. You lean on the staff, listening to the snow tick against the eaves. Then a sound. A shuffle, faint, deliberate. You grip the torch higher. The dog growls low, a sound like a bowstring drawn back. You step forward, breath sharp in your chest, and see only a figure. A boy, maybe 12, eyes wide, cheeks hollow. He freezes, caught between hunger and terror. You raise the staff, then lower it, heart twisting. Historians still argue whether medieval justice at the village level was harshly punitive or quietly merciful, shaped more by local custom than written law. Did thieves lose hands, as chroniclers claim, or did neighbours quietly forgive when they recognized their own hunger mirrored in another's face? Standing here, you feel the weight of that debate in your palm. The boy's ribs show through his tunic, his eyes plead in silence. You sigh, crouch, and mutter, "Wait." You slip into the storehouse, scoop a small bundle, an onion, a crust, a handful of beans. You thrust it at him. He stares, stunned, then bolts into the night like a startled hare. You know you've broken the rules, but you also know the rules sometimes break people first. Joke 2, you whisper to the dog. If anyone asks, you didn't see a thing. The dog sneezes in agreement. The hours crawl. You walk the perimeter, torch tracing circles of light. Each creak of the storehouse is a question. Is it just the wood, or a hand too bold? You shiver, not entirely from cold. Winter makes every shadow suspect. You catch yourself imagining thieves in every gust, wolves in every whisper, demons in every draught. Then you shake it off. Smoke and hunger are tricks enough without inviting more. You think of fire, not as warmth but as defense. Villages feared thieves who came not for food but vengeance, lighting thatched roofs like torches. Many households kept water buckets by the door, always half full, ready for flames. You glance at your own bucket, frozen over, and realize the irony. Even protection here needs protection. Another hour, another shuffle. This time it's only your neighbor, wrapped in a ragged cloak, taking his turn after you. His eyes are sunken, but he nods, grateful you kept the store intact. You hand him the staff, warn him about the cold, and mutter something vague about rustling in the hedge. He doesn't press. Some truths aren't meant for tally sticks. Historians still argue whether peasants trusted one another more than we imagine, bound by communal survival, or less, fractured by desperation and suspicion. The answer, you suspect, is both. Tonight, you trusted enough to spare a boy. Tomorrow, you may guard harder. The pendulum swings with the grain bins. You return to the cottage, the watch's chill clinging to your bone. The family sleeps, breath rising in steady clouds. You settle by the hearth, staff across your knees, cloak pulled tight, and finally let your eyes sag shut. The storehouse is safe for now, and so are they. Joke 3. You think about carving Guard Dog of the Year into the dog's collar, though his contribution was mostly dramatic sneezes. Still, he wagged at the right moments, and that counts. You drift towards sleep, haunted not by wolves this time, but by the boy's face, half hungry, half hopeful. Winter asks its questions in many voices, and tonight you answered with mercy. Tomorrow may test you differently, but for now you are tired, your watch complete, and the village's treasure still hidden behind wooden walls and a hedge of thorns. The fire shrinks to a red eye, then opens wider when you feed it a thumb of kindling. Sparks drift up like tiny saints with lanterns, and the room gathers close around them, knees to knees, cup to cup, breath to breath. This is the hour when work loosens its grip and the village remembers it has a voice. You nestle into your usual spot, the notch in the bench polished by 100 winters, and feel the warmed stone at your feet drowse against your ankles. The cow shifts by the door, the dog sighs like a small bellows, and a hush arrives that isn't silence so much as permission. Someone clears a throat. A story is about to start. It begins, as so many do, with a road and a traveller. The old man's voice has the grain of seasoned wood, and he lays the path one word at a time, a pilgrim walking to a shrine, pockets thin, heart thinner, winter biting his heels. He stumbles at dusk near a frozen stream, and who appears but St. Nicholas? No red suit, no sleigh, just a cloak like a slice of midnight and a hand warm enough to melt ice on sight. The saint leads him to a cottage where a widow has nothing but a crust, and by morning the crust has become a loaf, and the loaf has somehow fed 3 travellers and a cat who was only pretending not to be involved. You feel the room exhale in unison. Saints who multiply bread are the very definition of good company in January. Mainstream fact. Stories of saints' lives, the legenda aurea, the golden legend, travelled widely in medieval Europe, retold from pulpits and doorways alike, and they were winter favourites because hope makes the best kindling. You've heard Nicholas and Brigid, Martin sharing his cloak, and Blaise blessing throats with crossed candles. You'll hear them again, and happily, because repetition here is not boredom, it's reinforcement, the way you shore a wall before the storm. But the night doesn't belong only to saints. It belongs to the monsters you half believe in when the wind yowls in the thatch. Someone else, eyes laughing over the rim of a wooden cup, launches a tale about a hunter who followed lantern lights into the marsh. He was sure they were friends signalling him home. Of course they were will-o'-the-wisps, and of course they danced him all night, until by grace or luck he turned his clothes inside out and broke the spell at dawn. Quirky tidbit, whispered, as if it might still work. Turning a garment inside out confuses spirits who rely on order. The world blinks, the path reappears, and your soul, ideally, stays attached. You tug your sleeve, just in case, and everyone pretends not to notice. Children lean forward, faces cupped by lamplight. They love the saints, but they adore the monsters. The old woman with the story hoard who can knit and narrate simultaneously tosses them a dragon that sleeps in a barrow beyond the hedgerow, scaled like pine cones, eyes like embers. It demands a cow for breakfast every new moon, and the village meets the tax with scowls and rope. Feudal dues, but make it reptile. One year they trick it with a dummy cow stuffed with thorn branches. The dragon gulps, regrets everything, coughs for a week, and slinks into the river, where the ice gives it a stern lecture. Joke 1. You decide thorns might be the medieval answer to everything. Fences, door alarms, and now dragon dentistry. You sip small ale and listen. The liquid bread hums its soft reassurance, and the stories climb the room like ivy. Someone swaps in a tale of a midwinter giant who strides the ridgelines, counting cottages with a shepherd's crook. If he counts yours twice, you'll be blessed with double eggs in spring. If he forgets you, expect a late frost on the peas. Someone else counters with a fox spirit, too clever by half, who teaches a greedy reeve to miscount his own tally stick. You grin into your cup and don't say a word. The candle guttering on the table smells of tallow, and you remember the beeswax stub the candlemaker slipped you at the fair, a small sunshine you're saving for Candlemas. Stories are similar currency. You keep one or two bright ones tucked in your pocket, ready to spend if the room goes flat. The travelling tinker who tricked a demon with a mirror, the miller's daughter who fed an entire village by stretching one pot of pottage with polite lies about how full everyone already looked. Lies that make people generous. Well, those count as a kind of truth. Historians still argue whether the evenings were mostly family-bound or if neighbours routinely crowded together under a single roof to trade tales, especially in longhouses where beasts and people shared air. You've tasted both arrangements this winter. Intimate nights where the only audience is a snoring dog, and communal feasts of sound when 6 households squeeze around a hearth and the ceiling sweats with breath. Either way, the function is the same. Darkness arrives. Words turn it into a place you know. Someone asks for a true story, meaning, of course, one with names and places you can walk to. You oblige. You tell of the boy at the storehouse hedge tonight, the one whose ribs counted like prayer beads under his tunic. You leave out the fear, you keep the mercy. The room listens without judgment because everyone recognizes the geometry. Hunger makes thieves, stories make space around the shame so the village can breathe. The old woman nods like a judge delivering a sentence that is also a blessing. Your neighbour adds a tale from last winter. A cart broke through river ice near the ford. Men shouted, ropes flew, and just when it seemed the mare would vanish under the black pain, a stranger waded in, calm as a well-aimed prayer, and walked the horse out with nothing but a hand on her cheek. When they turned to Than, him, he was gone. Saint or kind soul. The story refuses to decide, and that's the point. You don't always need a name to remember grace. Joke 2. The juggler from the fair comes up, inevitably, now recast as a hero who distracted wolves with his turnip routine. You mime the tosses. 1, 2, 3, turnip. And the dog lifts his head, vaguely hopeful for snacks. Laughter plays across the room like quick light on water. A lull arrives. Good lull, not awkward. and you hear the house itself speaking, a beam easing in the cold, the cow rearranging her hooves, the cat conducting rodent diplomacy in the rafters. The nightcap warms your ears, your red-stitched hood stops dripping down your neck for once. The warmed stone remembers its mission at your feet. Even the straw mattress crackles like kindling made patient. You could sleep right here, sitting up, face toward the embers. Many do, slipping from first sleep's edge into that midnight island where stories float rather than march. The priest gets his due, as priests do, with a moral exemplum about the sin of gluttony. No one has the heart to point out the comedy of preaching excess to people eating thimblefuls of porridge. Instead, you let the lesson pass like incense, pleasant, not filling. Then the women take the floor and trade birthroom lore that is part herbology, part daring, part miracle. You learn again that the strongest monsters are sometimes fever and blood, and the bravest saints have calloused hands and an apron pocket full of yarrow. A cousin leans in with a fringe piece. Once, he swears, a piper led rats out of a granary with a tune so sweet even the cat blushed. Payment failed to arrive, and the piper claimed the village's children for apprentices. They followed, but he brought them back at dawn with pockets full of walnuts and a contract better drawn than any steward's. You can't tell if he's scolding you for underpaying musicians or warning you to mind your promises. Either way, you nod as if you've learned something permanent. Joke 3. You announce that if you ever meet a dragon, you'll invite it to the winter fair, charge the lord double for admission, and settle everyone's dues by sunset. The room snorts. The baby, startled by the sound, laughs too, which makes the joke land better than it deserves. You notice how the stories knit the room. Each thread loops through a memory. Bark bread gets a cameo as the pilgrim's worst meal. The alewife rescues a knight with a clean brew that undoes a swamp curse. The horse skull in the rafters acquires a backstory in which it once debated a demon and won on a technicality. Callbacks keep the night stitched to the day, and you feel safer for the continuity. This is the opposite of loneliness. This is community rehearsing itself out loud. When the last tale's tail flicks and disappears into the embers, you don't applaud. You let the quiet arrive like a blanket. The dog settles. The cow sighs. The room breathes together. You bank the fire under ash, your hand moving the way it has for years, slow, deliberate, sure. A few coals glow like watchful eyes. You trust them to hold until second sleep yields to morning. You tug the covers high, the warmed stone slides to a new comfortable continent at your feet, and the stories drift around your head, trailing sparks that think they're stars. If tomorrow brings thin porridge, let it also bring a new tale. If the reeve knocks, let a joke answer first. If wolves prowl the treeline, let St. Nicholas walk there too, cloak open, hand warm. You roll towards the human braid of heat, close your eyes, and carry the night's words with you into the soft dark, where even dreams know better than to drift too far from the fire. Morning opens with a cough, yours, then the baby's, then the old man's, like a creaking hinge that refuses oil. Winter is generous with two things, cold and colds. You sit up, feel the ache behind you. Our eyes like a small tenant demanding lower rent, and reach for the little bundle of dried plants hanging from the rafters. The cottage has always been part apothecary, part chapel, and part optimist. Today it is all three at once. You crumble a pinch of thyme into hot water, watch the steam bloom, and breathe like someone trying to drink warmth through their nose. The dog sneezes in solidarity, which counts as moral support if not medicine. A cup goes to the child first, honeyed and warm, coaxed down with the promise that it will tame the dragon in his throat. Yours is less sweet, more stern, a brew of yarrow, hyssop, and a memory of last summer's sun. Mainstream fact: Medieval household medicine leaned hard on herbs and humoral theory. The idea that health balanced four humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and illness meant something had tipped. Too much cold and wet. You need warm and dry. Winter, being an overachiever at cold and wet, invites remedies that chase heat. Spiced wine, mustard plasters, baths if you can manage the fuel, or at least a foot soak that convinces your toes to remember they're attached. You set a small pot to simmer with vinegar and a smashed clove of garlic, letting the scent march through the room like a strict aunt. Vinegar fumes are your poor person's fumigation. Some swear they scour the air of miasma, others just appreciate that it smells like something besides damp wool. You dab a little salve, tallow married to rosemary, under your nose. It's not perfume, it's a polite request to the world to be gentler for 5 minutes. Joke 1. You declare it "Oh, not today," certain it will be all the rage by the year 1320. A neighbour arrives with a packet of elderflower and advice seasoned with experience. "Steep it longer," she says, commandeering your cup with a look that brooks no argument. She lifts the baby, pats a rhythm on his beads, and listens to the rattle like a musician tuning a drum. If you had coin for every village healer's veto, you could buy beeswax candles year-round. You don't. So you offer thanks and a heel of bread instead. She pockets the bread, administers a scolding about drafts, and leaves a balm that smells faintly of pine. In winter, medicine is a barter system with a side of scold. Your mind wanders to the monastery a day's walk away, its infirmary, its walled garden rumoured to grow miracles in neat beds. Monks there keep herbals copied by steady hands, simples for fevers, poultices for wounds, syrups for chests that rattle like dice. Sometimes they share, sometimes they bless, sometimes they send you home with a posset, hot milk curdled with ale or wine and spiked with spice if their charity is feeling festive. Historians still argue whether peasants like you had ready access to monastic care, or if distance, duties and pride kept most healing inside cottages. What's certain is that knowledge leaks through walls. Recipes whispered at fairs, seeds traded with a wink, saints' days doubling as medical conferences with snacks. You set water to warm again and gather mustard seed for a plaster. Ground with vinegar, spread on a cloth, laid upon a chest. Mustard has opinions and expresses them as heat. You warn the child that it will tingle like a bee learning manners. He eyes you with suspicion, then bravely endures, only occasionally announcing that his chest is politely on fire. You nod. Politely on fire is better than politely drowning in phlegm. Across the room, the old man extends his knees for a rub of comfrey and animal fat, and you knead the ache away as if it were dough deciding to be bread. Quirky tidbit. Someone once swore by toad powder. Yes, a dried toad, crushed and mixed with wine, for fevers, while another aunt maintained that wearing a wolf tooth on a cord prevented toothaches out of professional courtesy among predators. You prefer your cures less theatrical, but you've also watched a charm around a neck calm a child far. Stir than any syrup. The line between medicine and magic blurs in winter. Frankly, you'll take whichever arrives first. The priest stops by after tierce, cloak shedding small diamonds of frost. He crosses the baby's brow with a candle stub and murmurs Saint Blaise's blessing for throats, a seasonal tradition that always feels like a little hinge opening in the air. He leaves behind a scrap of blessed salt and a reminder to keep the hearth swept. When he's gone, the room is no warmer, but you are. Placebo, grace, either way, you'll bank it like coals. You consider bleeding, the cure-all in humoral texts, but wince at the prospect. A village barber owns a set of fleams and a confidence that far outstrips his results. He'll gladly open a vein to chase excess humours, then prescribe rest and broth you can't afford to spare. Historians still argue whether routine bloodletting helped by accident, lowering pressure, prompting fluids, or harmed more than it healed. Tonight you decide your humours can regulate themselves with garlic and sleep. On the shelf waits theriac, or rather a peasant's approximation, a thick dark paste of spices and honey passed from hand to hand as if it were an heirloom. Real theriac is a luxury, dozens of ingredients and the assurance that kings trust it against poison. Yours tastes like courage and coughs into submission mostly because it refuses to be ignored. You lick a thumbful, pull a face and chase it with ale. Joke 2. You vow to invent a candy that cures everything and actually tastes good, then remember that even saints have limits. You crush dried rose hips for a tart drink, the closest thing you own to bottled sunshine. The colour alone convinces your spirits to stand up straighter. You brew willow bark tea for the old man, whispering an apology for its bitterness, and he forgives you with a grunt that translates to "My joints are less insult bonds, anctur." You pack onion poultices for chest tightness, tie a sprinkle of mint near the rafters to pretend the air has prospects, and heat a stone to tuck against small feet, some medicine. It turns out is a series of small kindnesses that add up to a night you can endure. Across the village, someone burns juniper on a shovel and walks the house widdershins to chase out illness. You can smell the smoke when the wind looks your way, sharp, hopeful, a ritual with ash on its hems. You tried it once and felt ridiculous and comforted in equal measure, which is likely the point. The dog watched solemnly, as if taking notes for his eventual career in pastoral care. You take stock of your little apothecary: elder, yarrow, thyme, garlic, mustard, comfrey, mint, willow. Enough to fight a good skirmish, not enough to win a war. Still, you've seen fevers break at dawn like bad weather. You've watched a cough loosen its grip after a night of steam and patience. You've watched onion poultices conjure miracles that might be more about time than onion but taste like gratitude anyway. You also know when to admit defeat, a fever that climbs like ivy, a child's ribs lifting too fast, a hush that falls too hard. Then you send for the midwife or begin the rosary or both, because you are a peasant and redundancy is your favourite technology. Joke 3. You suggest a new guild, the Brotherhood of Reasonable Remedies. Entry requirement: no toads, no leeches, without a note from a monk, and every potion must pass the "does this make the patient less grumpy" test. Membership applications flood your imagination. Reality keeps stirring the pot. By nightfall, the baby's cough softens to a sleepy hum. The old man's knees consent to bend without protest. Your head feels less like a drum and more like a room with a window. You bank the fire, stir the embers until they glow like small, watchful eyes, and tuck the warmed stone into its usual post at the foot of the bed. You set the cup with elder syrup within reach for midnight, because midnight has a sense of timing that isn't always helpful. Historians still argue whether winter made healers of everyone or merely made everyone desperate enough to pretend. You decide the difference hardly matters. Tonight you brewed, rubbed, rapped, prayed and joked. You kept the coughs from becoming stories with sad endings. Outside, the frost draws feathers on the shutter. Inside, your little apothecary breathes with you. Bottles clinking like quiet bells, herbs hanging like green promises against grey months. You settle under the heavy wool, listen for the baby's steadier rhythm, and let the steam-scented air tip you into sleep. Herbs, hope, and a candle's blessing tugging you along like a gentle hand. You wake to a different note in the air. Not warmth, not yet, but something gentler, like a hand loosening its grip. The wind still moans through the thatch, but less like a wolf and more like a tired dog curling to sleep. You pull back the shutter and blink. Snow still heaps against the hedges, but the icicles drip. Tiny threads of water slip from the roof, clear and musical, as if spring has mailed its first timid letter. Children rush out barefoot before anyone can stop them, squealing at the sting, then darting back in to warm their toes on the hearthstone. The cow's breath steams in thicker clouds, impatient for pasture she can smell but not yet see. You step outside, boots squelching in slush where yesterday they crunched on iron. The world is still white, but here and there earth peeks through like brown elbows nudging from under a blanket. Mainstream fact. Peasants marked the first thaw not with calendars but with signs like this: melting roofs, sap rising in trees, birds testing the air. The approach of spring was both promise and gamble. The hungry gap began here, when stores ran thin but fields had not yet given new crops. The cellar might be nearly empty, but the green shoots weren't food yet. They were only hope. You crouch by the stream. Yesterday it was a pane of glass. Today it sings, trickling under ice crusts. You cup a hand, drink, and wince at the chill, but it tastes alive. Quirky tidbit. Some villagers swore by the first meltwater of spring as a tonic, carrying it home in jugs to sprinkle on animals, children, and doorways to wake everything from winter's spell. You gather a palmful now, flick it toward the cow as she lows. She blinks, unimpressed, but you tell yourself she's secretly grateful. Joke 1. You consider bottling it as spring water limited medieval edition, though you suspect the marketing department of the future would insist on fancier labels. The reeve walks past, tally stick under his cloak, muttering that fields must soon be prepared. You glance at the furrows lying beneath snow like scars under a bandage. It's too early, the ground still clutches its frost. But already tools are pulled from sheds, blades sharpened, seeds inspected, as if preparing alone could summon warmth. Work hangs in the air like a question everyone is eager to answer. Your hands itch for soil, though all you can touch is mud. You test a spade against the earth. It shudders, half sunk, refusing. Another week, perhaps 2, perhaps longer. The uncertainty gnaws as much as hunger. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly despaired in this season, or whether ritual and resilience carried them more calmly than we assume. To you, standing knee-deep in slush with an empty stomach, despair and hope taste almost identical. The cellar is nearly bare. You open the trapdoor and count again. 5 onions soft with age, 3 parsnips sprouting pale threads, a smear of beans at the bottom of a sack. Salt pork, reduced to 1 hard slab. You run your palm across it, then across your ribs. Survival isn't guaranteed, not now, not yet, but the drip outside says something different. Wait. Neighbours gather at the edge of the green, pointing at birds swooping low, at buds daring the tips of branches. Children stomp in puddles, pretending they command the thaw. Women compare stores, some whispering fear, others sharing spare leeks. There is barter again, cautious but louder than in January. A man trades an extra sack of barley for wool. A woman offers goat's milk in exchange for nails. The community breathes out together, the same way fields exhale when frost finally loosens. You remember the fair, the ginger biscuits, the juggler's turnip. You remember the coughs eased by herbs, the stories stretched across long nights. You remember wolves at the treeline, their eyes like lanterns. Each memory sits heavy, then lighter, as the thaw promises it wasn't for nothing. Joke 2. You mutter that if spring delays too long, you'll hire the parish bell to ring at the sky until it listens. The children overhear, laughing, already planning a chant to back you up. The priest arrives with news of rogation days ahead, when fields will be blessed, boundaries walked, and prayers chanted for fertility. Already he practices the litanies, and already you picture yourself trailing behind, boot deep in mud, asking heaven to notice your strip of soil this year. It's not just ceremony, it's negotiation. You will need every ally, mortal and divine, to coax bread from earth again. Evenings still carry frost, but the light lingers a heartbeat longer. In the cottage, smoke rises with a different smell, broth thinner than ever, but flavoured with the optimism of planting soon. You share your last crusts more easily than you expected. Spring is stingy with food, but generous with imagination. Historians still argue whether this hungry gap was truly the worst season, or whether late autumn with its frantic labours carried heavier fear. To you, scraping your bowl clean while lice steening to the drip from the eaves, this is the sharpest hunger, a season when hope sits at the table but refuses to pass the bread. You stretch out on the straw, warmed stone at your feet, listening to the thaw drip like a metronome of patience. Wolves still prowl, tools still break, dews still loom. But the ice has blinked, and that blink feels like a wink. You whisper to yourself, 1 more week, maybe 2, and green will rise. Joke 3, you tell the dog that if he sees the first sprout of barley, he should bark 3 times and charge you rent. He yawns, unimpressed, but curls against your side anyway. Together you fall asleep with the faintest scent of earth, damp, waking, promising, threading the air. The thaw deepens, dripping into ditches, softening the ruts of the village road until every cartwheel moans like an old hymn. You walk slowly, boots heavy with mud, watching fields emerge from their white shrouds. The land looks ragged, scarred by frost, littered with broken stalks and patches of stubborn ice. And yet, to your eyes, it is beautiful, like a face waking from a long illness. Every furrow promises that something will rise again if you can endure a little longer. The neighbours gather at the edge of the fields, muttering about oxen, about seeds saved from last year, about tools held together with more prayer than iron. Someone jokes that the ploughshare will break on the first day. Someone else swears this year's barley will be kinder. You nod, listening, because these aren't just conversations. They're survival strategies spoken aloud to steady the heart. Mainstream fact, peasants depended utterly on these cycles. A single bad harvest could ripple through an entire year, and consecutive failures meant famine. Winter's lessons weren't just about enduring, they were about remembering the cost of scarcity, so that when the fields finally softened, every seed was placed with reverence. You walk back toward the cottage, thinking of the winter's litany, smoke-choked rooms, porridge bowls scrape, thin, moss stuffed in boots, stories woven into warmth, wolves prowling at the edge of firelight, hunger, fear, duty, and endless mending, yet somehow you are still here and not alone. Each moment of shared heat, each joke muttered against the cold, each neighbour's onion traded for thread, those were the real tools of survival. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some chroniclers recorded villagers celebrating the very first green shoots with mock feasts, placing sprigs on tables as if they were roast meats, laughing at the absurdity but also honouring the miracle. You can picture yourself doing it now, holding up a blade of barley and toasting it like a king's banquet. Joke 1. You imagine writing a menu, tonight's course mud à la hope garnished with sprout, and charging admission. Historians still argue whether peasants saw themselves as endlessly downtrodden or quietly proud of their endurance. You lean toward pride, not the pomp of lords with banners, but the pride of people who learned to wrestle February with smoke, straw, and stubborn jokes, who carved life out of frost with nothing but bare hands and each other. That pride is quieter, but it lasts longer. Back at the hearth, you watch the last of the salted pork drop into a pot, knowing it marks the true end of winter's pantry. The smell is thin, but it carries a weight of relief. You hand bowls around, each sip like a benediction. We made it. The children slurp noisily. The old man nods once and closes his eyes. The cow shifts as if approving from her corner. The fire crackles, and for the first time in months, it feels less like defense and more like celebration. You stretch your feet toward the coals, letting warmth creep into your bones, and think of what winter taught. That community is the thickest blanket, that jokes are as necessary as bread, that every onion, every story, every stitch holds more power than it seems. And above all, that survival is not just an act of endurance, it is an act of memory. You will carry these lessons into spring, into sowing, into the years when frost will again test your patience. Joke 2. You raise your cup of small ale and toast the winter itself. to the season that tried to kill us but only succeeded in making us smell permanently of smoke. The laughter that follows is tired but also triumphant. The wind outside softens. Inside, the room hums with something new, not just relief, but possibility. Tomorrow, the tools will creak back into the fields. Tomorrow, you'll crouch with dirt under your nails again. Tomorrow, the story changes. Story